time. Oh, won't it be your time? Oh, won't it be your time? Oh, talking with the angels. Won't it be your time? If you know it, you can help me. Say one more time. I'll say, won't it be your time? Oh, won't it be your time?
Shalom, saints, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. Want to, of course, say shaloms all around if there's anybody currently in the live chat. If you are here, please do remember to like and share this video and consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Remember, you can leave any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, anything of that nature in the comment section down below. And in this particular instance, we are doing a live stream. So if you're here live, you want your question to be answered by me live or by my guest live, any and all super chats will be answered on stream. Let me go ahead and put my screen up or my image up here real quick. Just 1 second. All right, and then we just get that camera on. There we go. All right, so yeah, any and all super chats will be answered here on screen, of course, or on stream rather. Of course, provided they are appropriate, but I've never had an issue with you guys doing that before. Also, if you want to contribute to the work we are doing here, there are various ways you can do so. We are on Gab, Facebook. I am on Gab, Facebook, Minds, Twitter, Parler, etc. All these different social media platforms. If you are frequenting those social media platforms, please do consider liking, or after you like this channel, or oh my goodness, come on, Jay, let's go. After you like this video and share this video, getting it onto those social media platforms in particular. Actually, that'd be part of the sharing process, I guess, right? But nevertheless, and of course, you can follow your boy on any of those different social media platforms. I greatly appreciate it when you do. You can contribute to the work we are doing here in various ways. I have content on Patreon for you guys if you'd like to contribute in that way. So it's my video blog, bi-weekly video blog, Breakfast Tea. It's $5 monthly. And so far we've gotten pretty positive reviews for that from the few people who have actually decided that they wanted to watch it. So if you're interested in getting some extra synagogue content, please do consider following there on the Patreon. Again, it's $5 monthly if you want access to that. You can give a one-time donation to the PayPal if you'd like to contribute that way. Super chat, super stickers, super thanks, of course, which also allows you to ask a question here. Channel memberships are an option, and you can also become a card-carrying member of my book club. And I'm just kidding about that. But you can buy the book. 15 Questions for Calvinists Answered. Link is going to be provided in the description below. It's not currently, so if you want to see it, then you'll have to ask me, and I'll throw it in the live chat. Other things you'll find in the link below after this video is put up. If you're watching this live, it's not there, are links to my other channels, the Synagogue News and Polymathis. Synagogue News is, of course, a news and politics channel, while Polymathis is a rap channel where I publish my music. You'll also find links to the paper I am actually going to be referencing here today on the Deity Deception Argument, why Dr. Tim Stratton's DOD argument fails. And you will be able to find links to my guestacademia.edu account. There are actually numerous papers he has published on that account that are directly related to the topic we're talking about today. Not so much in the DOD position, but in the libertarian free will and specifically Dr. Tim Stratton's arguments for libertarian free will kind of vein. So go ahead and check that out if you guys are interested. Links will also be provided to the article we're reviewing today, as well as to the channel and website from which it hails. And as far as stuff we have planned for the future, not a whole lot right now. The only thing I can say is that we do have this conference that is being planned. It's my understanding is that it is being pushed back at the moment. So we were originally telling you guys December 5th to 6th. My understanding is that is not going to happen. And in fact, I think we might end up moving this to probably sometime early next year. At least that's, again, my understanding. This is all kind of in development right now. So, some tentative excitement for that. But beyond that, there's really nothing set in stone. And even that's not really set in stone. So I don't want to share with you guys any of the plans coming up until I have something more concrete to share with you. Please be in prayer for that conference, because if it is going to happen, it's going to happen on the spiritual and financial backs of viewers like you, to quote PBS. At any rate, it's really all we got as far as channel housekeeping. So let's go ahead and jump into our prayer, and then we're going to have a good episode today. I think we'll probably try and keep this one a little shorter than what we typically do. Usually when we have a guest on, we can hit somewhere between 2 and 3 hours. But then again, you might end up watching this 2 hours from now and realizing that I'm talking out my tuchus. We'll see what happens. Anyways, let's go ahead and jump into our prayer, and we'll get on with this video. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you once again for the opportunity to make this content, Lord. I want to ask for edification for your body through this video, Lord, as well as glorification of your name. And I want to pray that this video is something that leads to greater truth, or that helps us to seek truth. I pray that both me and my guest, as well as the audience today, be vigilant in seeking truth, I guess is the word I'm looking for, Lord, as well as the people we're responding to, Mr. Klein, and by proxy, Dr. Stratton. All of us want to better glorify you and find the truth, Lord, and I just pray that you help us to do that, be repelled by falsehood, and be vigilant for truth and truth seeking. I ask these things in Jesus' name, we give you glory. Amen. All right, friends. So, brief introductions, of course, as we always do when we have a guest. The introductions these days are getting more and more brief just because Colton is on more and more times. However, there's always the possibility. I woke up today, I had 1,786 subscribers. So 3 of you are new. But anyways, at any rate, go ahead and share a little bit about yourself if you'd like, Colton, and thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you. I love being here. So, Colton Carlson, I'm a math and philosophy teacher down in Arizona. Been doing that for close to 10 years. I love it. Teaching students about philosophy and helping them use philosophy to better their lives, because that's kind of the point, right? To live a wiser life, the love of wisdom. So, and I just kind of dabble with regards to free will. I got interested in free will in like 2020 after reading some of Alvin Batinga's book, and then God, Freedom, and Evil, and then talking with mutual friends from CJ and I, like Chris Dates, and getting into the Braxton Hunter groups, and Dave Paulman. So, and then just kind of sparked from there, read Bignon's book, and then I just got addicted to free will. And I can't go back. I don't know why. My wife thinks I'm crazy, but I literally read free will, academic philosophy, free will every single day. I just submitted 2 papers on academic scholarship on free will, one concerning the general ability. Unfortunately, it was rejected, and one's underneath review. Very niche. They're not on my academia page because I want to reserve that for actual content when it gets published. And I am adamant and confident enough, maybe annoyingly so, maybe in a non-humble way, but I'm very, very confident that will be published soon. If not from this journal, then I'll just publish a different one. So, but yes, had a lot of philosophers read it. It's currently under review. It's on compatibilism. And I'm working on my 3rd. So I love free will. I've written a lot of things about free will. It's on my academia page, just like what CJ said, primarily with regards to Tim Stratton. I'm I'm his biggest fan, as I always say. I think he hates that, but I think it's true because I've probably read him more than anyone else has, and probably has responded to him more than anyone else has. So I think that's probably right, CJ. I'm not sure. You can correct me, but
I
so
honestly, I don't know of anyone else.
700 pages altogether. Not every single page is completely dedicated just to that man, but in the broader scheme, it's about his overall philosophy, whether it includes him or not. So, regardless, I love being here. I love talking about philosophy. So, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again for being here. And again, guys, if you're watching this after we go live, I forgot to set up a description today, but if you're watching this after we're live, links will be provided in the description to the academia page that was just being mentioned, as well as probably some of these specific articles there, particularly his article on Colton's article on 1 Corinthians 10:13 and his volume 2 article in the 3-parter. So now, granted, not that you guys can fail to think for yourself in that regard. You might want to read all of them, and I'd even recommend it, although I have not yet read the 3rd volume. Nevertheless, I think it'd probably be worth your time. So, with all of that being said, what are we doing here today? Well, that's a good question, hypothetical Jimmy in the audience. What we are doing here today is that I recently wrote, and I guess it's not too recently at this point, but I wrote an article on the deity of deception argument, which, of course, Tim Stratton loves. He is the originator of it, so I understand having some kind of an attachment to it. But nevertheless, wrote an article on it and published it on my own academia.edu page. I pestered Dr. Stratton until he finally decided to answer in the form of a very long Twitter thread. I responded in that very long Twitter thread with my own very long Twitter thread. And then we ended up getting an article from Josh Klein, J.R. Klein, on his, who's his co-host over there at Free Thinking Ministries. And he took the time to read over my article and give a detailed response. And so I decided, of course, it's first off, thank you, Mr. Klein, if you ever end up reading this. But secondly, it's, if he decided to take the time to respond to my stuff, I should probably take the time to respond to his stuff. And then Colton graciously offered his services in helping out, which is actually particularly good in this regard, because it's not like me and Colton see eye to eye on everything, right? One of the cool things that I think we have on this side, not to criticize the other side, but you very rarely see pushback live from like Warren McGrew and Leighton Flowers when they do a stream together, even though they do disagree on stuff. With us, with Colton, with myself, with Chris Date, with Israel Trujillo, you tend to see more of that. And I actually think that's a good thing. I think it's a positive thing that allows us to get closer and closer to the truth. So that's one of the great benefits, I think, to having a sort of a intellectual fearlessness, if you will, right? Oh, we don't want to make sure we want to make sure everybody sees a united front. It's like, well, you can still be a united front and disagree with people. That's perfectly fine. At any rate, that's what we're going to be going over here today. I'm also going to share with you guys Dr. Stratton's new version, as he calls it, of the deity of deception argument, and go through why, of course, I think that it doesn't work, and so on and so forth. The other thing I'd like to say here real quick, just to shamelessly promote myself, is please do consider reading my paper for yourself. It has gotten some pretty solid endorsements. Not to say that people are endorsing absolutely everything that is in it. Obviously, each person is responsible for their own views, and that includes me, right? I'm responsible for my own views. But I've gotten some pretty solid endorsements from a J.G. Klein over there at UNR, Dr. Sean Gould, Chris Date, of course, Colton. And, so this is worth your time, I think, right? And again, not everybody is supporting every single thing, but, I think it is worth your time and effort at the very least. And I appreciate in advance anybody who decides to check it out. With that, is there anything you'd like to add before we screen share this article?
I'm good.
All right. So let's go ahead and pull the screen share up. And while I'm pulling the screen share up, allow me to read for you guys this new version of the deity of deception argument. Okay. For those of you who are not aware of the old version, I guess I should probably read that first. So let's do this. So this first version I'm going to read is the deity of deception argument as laid out in Dr. Tim Stratton and Dr. J.P. Moreland's 2022 paper on the free thinking argument. Remember, the free thinking argument is the main point of the paper, and the deity of deception argument is found within that paper. You could really call this an extension of the free thinking argument, actually. It's not so much an argument unto itself, even though we've been treating it as such. So premise one, if EDD, that is exhaustive divine determinism, is true, then God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs. Premise two, if God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs, then God is deceptive and his word cannot be trusted, i.e. the Bible. Premise three, God is not deceptive and his word can be trusted. Premise four, therefore, God does not determine all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs. Conclusion, therefore, exhaustive divine determinism is false. Again, that is the deity of deception argument as given in Stratton and Moreland's paper from 2022. This is now then the new version, as Stratton has referred to it, which I don't think he's given in anything academic, although I believe he's going to. But so far, I think it is only to be found on his Twitter page. But nevertheless, this is how it goes. Premise one, if God determines all things, then he determines every thought, belief, and action. Premise two, all people, including Christians, hold false theological beliefs. Premise three, God determines all people, therefore God determines all people to affirm false theological beliefs. Premise four, a being who intentionally determines people to believe falsehoods about ultimate reality is, by definition, functioning as a deceiver, even if it is said to serve a greater purpose. Premise five, or conclusion rather, so if exhaustive divine determinism, i.e. EDD, is true, God functions as a deity of deception. So if you didn't catch what exactly the difference is, that's perfectly fine. It's mainly scope. The first DOD argument is trying to demonstrate that EDD is false. So it's a little bit larger in scope. The second one here is basically just trying to focus on the idea that if EDD is true, if determinism is true, he's got me saying it now, if determinism is true, then God operates as a deity of deception. So it's a little bit more focused in that regard. In regard to our side, I don't think it is terribly different because I think the responses ultimately end up being the same. But I think that's where the majority of the differences lie. And with that, now we can go ahead and pull up this article. Oh, that's my article. Sorry. We're just a beacon of professionalism here today. Professionalism. That's just a perfect example of exactly what I'm talking about. Sorry, friends. Don't usually have this much trouble at the start of these videos. So this is the article, The Deity of Deception Argument, a Response to C.J. Cox Yo. It was published August 4th, 2025, and its author is, again, J.R. Klein, or Josh Klein, the co-host of the Free Thinking Ministries podcast that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but if not, that's perfectly fine. Just know that he works with Dr. Stratton, and he is publishing this response on Dr. Stratton's blog. One thing I'd like to note here very briefly, just because there is certainly a kind of elitism that shows up sometimes in some of Stratton's arguments. Me and Josh Klein are on the same playing field, and same thing with Colton, as it pertains to our degrees. In fact, I think that I am probably a little bit farther in terms of philosophy degrees. And I know for a fact, Colton, I don't know for a fact, you have a bachelor's degree in philosophy. Is that right?
I have a bachelor's degree in theology.
In theology, okay.
In philosophy, but the title is theology and Bible.
Okay. So we're all on the same playing field here then, right? So there can't be any of this, I only decide to operate with PhDs. And the PhDs I talk to say this, first off, none of us are PhDs. And second off, I talk to PhDs to say different things. So everybody's got their pet PhDs, right? At any rate.
I will say, I like how Tim McGrew says it, who is a PhD. He works in epistemology, and He's an internalist when it comes to epistemology. He's actually really profound in the epistemological circles. He says, and I'm going to paraphrase, he's one of my favorite quotes from him. If you know what you're talking about and you have a PhD, I don't care if you have a PhD. If you don't know what you're talking about and you have a PhD, or you don't have a PhD, I don't care if you have a PhD. So in both case scenarios, what's the main thing? Know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Know your stuff, and it's literally irrelevant whether you have a PhD. And I think that kind of levels the playing field a bit. And I always take that kind of quote to heart. And that tells us that we can interact with some of this stuff as long as we have a good argument and we know what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. And especially, some of the most intelligent people on the apologetics front lines these days do not actually have PhDs, and some of the least intelligent people on the front lines here do. And that's not to say all, of course. There are some brilliant PhDs out there, and of course there are some absolute morons who are just running their standard YouTube channel. But I think as a general rule, everybody can accept the fact that yes, sometimes the PhDs are idiots, and sometimes the guys who don't have them are pretty intelligent, and vice versa, of course, as well. So I think that's a pretty good quote there. I don't know a lot about Tim McGrew, but anyways, let's go ahead and read this here. And I guess it was not necessary for me to read the Twitter post because he's got it actually right here. But anyways, starts off, this argument isn't just a clever thought experiment. It goes straight to the heart of whether a deterministic worldview can sustain rational trust. Right off of the bat, I have to say, I had a problem with this because the point of the new argument is supposed to be that we're focusing specifically on whether or not God is a deity of deception, whereas the bigger one is trying to prove EDD is false by means of some kind of epistemological meltdown. So it seems to me like we're trying to have the cake of the old argument, the old formulation, and eat the cake of the new argument, the new formulation too. But minor detail, just slightly annoying in my opinion. If God determines every thought and belief, including the false ones, then we have to ask, how could anyone, including committed Calvinists, know which of their beliefs are true? That's why the DOD argument has stirred so much discussion. It raises a serious question about the logical and epistemic consequences of exhaustive divine determinism, or EDD. The argument goes like this. If God determines all things, he determines every thought, belief, and action. All people, including Christians, hold false theological beliefs. Therefore, God determines all people to affirm false theological beliefs. A being who intentionally determines people to believe falsehoods about ultimate reality is, by definition, functioning as a deceiver. Therefore, if exhaustive divine determinism is true, God functions as a deity of deception. And he does note in this, right, that, like we said earlier, that little parenthetical, even if he's a deceiver, even if said deception comes for a greater purpose, right? This is a question about logical entailment. Does consistent Calvinism entail exhaustive divine determinism? And if so, how do you avoid the deity of deception problem? So this is the first point we're going to pause on. First of all, do you have any comment on the formulation itself before I move on to this little?
Yeah, honestly, for 3 years, I've been looking at different variations of Stratton's arguments, and honestly, I think, and this is, me personally, I think each of them gets worse as they kind of go on. It makes it super obvious in my mind which premise a determinist is going to obviously deny, and that's premise 4. So premise 4, then he quite literally defines this whole formulation. Is, to me, it's honest. Like, I don't know how else it can be non-question begging, because it defines, by definition, someone, like a determining thing, as that thing. So if God determines, we'll get into this, but if God determines me to drink beer, let's say, that therefore by definition functions God as a beer drinker. So if he determines to deceive, then that by definition means he's a deceiver. No determinist is going to accept that premise. And so and he says by definition, and so that means he's defining it like this is properly basic or whatever the junk word, something that's obvious, and it's just not true based on a definition of what it means for God to determine something. So I think this formulation is so much worse than all than his previous. Like I think he had previous two, like one way back in the day, like in 2021 or 22, I think. And then one he reformulated it, I think in early 23, 22 with JP Moreland, kind of changed some things around. I forget, but and that one was okay. That had a couple premises that you had to kind of defeat and look at. This one is a lot more straightforward, and it just, thanks for doing all the hard work for me. It's clear that 4 to me is question begging, because it just is going to define God. If you are a God who determines deception, then you just are, by definition, a deity of deception. And I just reject that entire entailment. And I don't see any independent reason for why that antecedent necessitates the consequence. Like I don't see why we go from antecedent P then Q. And I think premise 4 is the one that gives it away. I'll let you talk more about it, but that's my first initial thought.
Yeah, and I largely agree. And I'll say real briefly before I get to my own comment that it is interesting how the more specific this argument gets, the easier it is to defeat, which is almost a way of saying the original argument was flawed to begin with, because it's a little bit too broad to start, I think. And then the more it tries to hone in on what exactly it's trying to say, the more we're like, no, yeah, that's actually what the problem is. So I find that to be a little bit interesting. Maybe I'm the only one noticing that, but it sounds like no, actually, I'm not. So that's cool. Briefly, before I get my comment here, pseudonym, I don't really know what the comment means, but you did pay for it. And I told you I'd say, I'd interact with it if you paid for it. So thank you for that. He says, it seems like both agree Calvinism is inconsistent. If you're talking about me and Colton, no, I think both of us would actually agree with the exact opposite of that. And I'm not sure why you had gotten that impression, but nevertheless.
Yeah, I don't even think we mentioned Calvinism yet.
No, I don't think we have either.
Now, for the record, CJ is far more of a Calvinist in my mind than I am. Like for sure. Right. Like he's more of a consistent Calvinist, I would say, than me. But I still classify myself as a Calvinist, and so does CJ. So I don't know where the junk this comment comes from. Yeah. I'm not sure if he's been paying attention to any of our videos, to be honest.
Yeah, and that's very true, right? Because I think we're consistently trying to defend the idea that Calvinism is, in fact, consistent. But thank you, nevertheless, pseudonym, for your interaction there. And I appreciate the comment. So I wanted to comment here on this last portion of Stratton's tweet where it says, there's a question of logical entailment. Does consistent Calvinism entail EDD? And if so, how do you avoid this deity of deception problem? And beyond the rather obvious point of, well, yeah, I think that's one of the keys of Calvinism is that you affirm determinism. I know some have argued with that. Greg Kokel calls himself a Calvinist, but does not affirm determinism. Respectfully, I've heard his explanations. I don't think they work. But beyond that, the bigger problem, I think, with this question, does consistent Calvinism entail EDD? And if so, how do you avoid this deity of deception argument? Is, and I want to make sure I'm wording this precisely. The question really is, does determinism entail God, that God is untrustworthy? That's the point, right?
Yeah.
And it does seem to me like some of this other language is just a little bit, I don't know, it's unnecessary. Maybe I'm straining at gnats here, but we don't need the EDD thing. We don't need the question about consistent Calvinism. We don't need the reference even to the DOD problem. The question is quite simply, if determinism, then deception, yes or no, right? So I don't know. Again, I know I got some nitpicks here in the start of this, but I do find them to be somewhat relevant. That's my channel, so I'm going to nitpick, okay? Anyway.
Yeah, I take, to answer the question, and we're going to all get into it, but he had the question, how do you avoid the deity of deception problem? I think there's two ways that the Calvinist who affirms divine determinism, or what they call ed, in my mind annoyingly, but we've exhausted that.
Yeah.
Pun intended. Okay. Is this, there's two responses. Number one, you could take a soft line approach and just say, yes, determinism doesn't entail that God is untrustworthy, therefore a deity of deception, because here's the relevant difference. Or you can take a hardline approach and say, you're right, there is no relevant difference. God is a deity of deception, but it doesn't much matter morally, regardless of whether or not divine determinism is in fact true. And so I lean more towards the hard line response personally. I think CJ in his paper has kind of dabbled with the soft line response, if I remember correctly, trying to point out there's a relevant difference. So we'll get into that, but that's how I like to frame the dialectic in the debate. There's really two kinds of thought that a Calvinist determinist could respond here. Is there a relevant difference between God determining and him being a deity of deception, or a hardline response? I tend towards a hardline, but I have a response for both. So I think that maybe helps frame how we will respond and how we would avoid this so-called problem.
Yeah, and to that second point, one of the things that has been a point of confusion for some in the paper is that I actually do argue from both positions. And the reason I do that is because I think it fails regardless of which position you take. So in other words, I think the argument fails in that and as we keep saying, this is going to be more fleshed out as we go on. I think the argument fails in that determining A is not the same thing as being the adjectival form of A yourself. And I also think the argument fails in that God definitely does deceive in the scriptures, and it's not even really disputable. I have met people who try to dispute it, but it doesn't work, to say the least, right? It's one of those things where not only are there texts which just say, I, the Lord, have deceived this person, but then there are also like entailments where it's you can't get around this. Now, I want to be clear, neither I or Colton are making the argument that God is immoral for doing so, because I think that's where people ultimately go from that is, are you then impugning God's character? No, not all deceptions are created equal. Not all deceptions are lies, for example. Play action pass in football is certainly not the same as a lie, nor is it a sin. Unless somebody wants to make an argument that a play action pass is sin. I'd really like to hear that from Stratton, because he's a Nebraska fan and they're famous for the I formation option. But I'll digress on that. So I think that's where where we're going to go through here is wording this terribly again. We're going to end up approaching it from both perspectives, because I think the argument really does fail on both perspectives. Pseudonym gives another super chat. Actually has two more super chats here. I appreciate you paying me, man, but I have no idea what you're trying to say. How is it consistent if you agree it is, then it's not? No? I don't know. I don't even know what to do with that. Calvinist or trolls, if they can take both, Josh. Pseudonym, I am going to continue to read these if you give them, because they are meeting my appropriate thing, my appropriate rule. But you got to be clear on what you're trying to say, man, because I don't even know how to respond to these. And I feel bad because now you're just giving me money and I'm not giving you anything in return. But yeah, please be clearer with your questions. But thank you for these.
We have never affirmed Calvinism. I mean, besides just a moment ago. So, so we are both Calvinists. We would claim that it is consistent, and we are arguing against a position that is non-Calvinist, and their argument is against the Calvinistic piece. So obviously, since we're Calvinists, we're going to argue against that non-Calvinist argument.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
That kind of helps frame the dialectic, or maybe it doesn't. I don't know, but we should move on.
All right, so back to the article. It says many people offered a response to the original post, and it even led to a video about Grok published recently. If you podcast by clicking this footnote, which actually I have seen that episode. I actually don't entirely disagree with Stratton in that episode. We're not going to get into it because it's not the point here. But suffice it to say, Grok and ChatGPT and etc. are not Not good philosophers. Put it that way.
Yeah.
Stratton has offered different versions of the deity of deception argument over the past 3 years, and they have been the object of much discussion within the philosophical and theological world recently, leading one young and up-and-coming Calvinist to write a blog on academia in an attempt to refute it. I gotta say, I like being called upcoming, so thank you for that. That's pretty cool. That was a little stroke to my ego, so thank you. I don't know how true it is, but I appreciate it nevertheless. Anyways, CJ Cox responded to Dr. Stratton's challenge on X by inviting him to respond to the article which Dr. Stratton did here, note footnote 4, which we won't get into that one because we're responding specifically to Josh. This prompted Cox to respond in a long series of X posts speaking to why he saw Stratton's responses as lacking. It is this post which I seek to address in this blog and by extension Cox's blog on academia.com. It's .edu, but that's okay. I don't normally wade into these waters very often as I am just starting my PhD journey on such complex and important issues. To be fair, me too. So we're in the same boat. However, after reading CJ Cox's response, I felt compelled to address it. From CJ Cox's Why This Response Doesn't Work thread. All right, so here we are. So he quotes me, and by the way, I'd just like to say right off the bat, because he does note he's edited some of the wording for readability and grammar. I have checked it back with what I originally wrote. Everything Klein edited here is accurate. So in case anybody wants to accuse him of being deceptive in his editing, you cannot do so because I wrote the tweets and I'm telling you he did so accurately. He represents me accurately. So, quote from me, calling an argument pedantic is not actually a substantive argument. The fact is semantics, procedure, structure, and the like are incredibly important, really in general, but especially in syllogistic logic. The DOD is a deductive argument, meaning its strength rests in the fact that all premises, if true, render the conclusion certain. If your deductive argument is actually only likely true, i.e. inductive, then it fails at a fundamental level. That is not merely pedantic, it is crucial. To briefly explain, my argument there is that Stratton wants the strength of a deductive argument because deductive arguments, if the premises are true, conclusions are certain. But he argues using inductive premises, which I think removes that strength. That's something you find in my original piece. It is not something you're going to find in my second version of the piece just because I think we've moved on beyond that point. But nevertheless, we'll talk about it a little bit more here. The response is, this doesn't really answer the charge of Stratton. Deductive arguments are free to use generally true statements that are likely true. In fact, many arguments are made this way, which is why the best way to defeat a sound deductive argument is to show that one of the premises is likely false, or at least not probably true. As Cox says in his paper, a deductive argument is one that relies on the certainty of its premises in order to guarantee its conclusion, and I do say that. But does a deductive argument rely on the certainty of its premises? Cox seems to assume that certainty means that each premise of a deductive argument must also be deductively concluded in separate arguments. This is simply wrong. One can use an inductive premise in a deductive argument. I didn't mean to do that. To say otherwise is either disingenuous or ignorant of how the form of argumentation works. For instance, here's a valid deductive argument which uses an inductive premise. All metals expand when heated. Iron is a metal, therefore iron expands when heated. When Dr. Stratton says Cox is being pedantic, this is what he means. You cannot dismiss the argument simply because one of the premises is inductive. That's not how it works. You must demonstrate why said inductive premise should not be used in its logical flow of the argument or why the inductive premise is not justified. Now, let's pause here for a moment because I think that this actually illustrates precisely why I am making a stink about this point. He says all metals expand when heated, which is, he calls that inductively justified. Iron is a metal, therefore iron expands when heated, right? Now, I would not call the first premise of this inductive. I think I would call this first premise. This is something that you are as certain of this truth as you possibly can be at the very least, right? That's not necessarily what we mean here. If you go back to the original paper, I actually use the example of the famous Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal thing, right? If you've ever taken a Philosophy 101 class, you'll probably recognize that as one of the very first things your teacher told you when he's talking to you about deductive logic. The syllogism goes, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. Or you actually flip those first two premises, but it doesn't matter, right? And I point out in the article, you can't say all men are mortal, Socrates is likely a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? Because that second premise, you're saying it's probably true, that Socrates is a man. But I can always say, well, the second premise being only probably true does not guarantee the conclusion here, because it could very well be false. Probably, I mean, what level of probability are we talking about here? You could get into little pedantics like that. You're talking 50.1% and all this other kind of nonsense, right? But the point there is just to say, you can't go from likely true in this instance. Socrates is likely a man. Therefore, Socrates definitely is mortal. You can't make that connection. That's the whole point of the induction, deduction, separation, right? And when I say you're as certain as you possibly can be that all metals expand when heated, well, you're not as certain as you possibly can be that Socrates is a man in this particular example, right? Because you even add yourself, it's only likely true in this particular syllogism that Socrates is a man, right? So I think the second example he gives is actually a better example for his point, but it actually, I feel like, it illustrates my point a little bit better. If you're using an inductive argument, by the way, that is fine. The deity of deception argument is not wrong if it's inductive. It's just not as strong as Stratton wants it to be. And I think that's a key point that's being missed here. But my understanding is that we don't actually agree on this point. So take it away, Colton. The floor is yours.
Honestly, I don't have much to say. After reading, I never was really convinced by this line of argument from CJ, just because I do think Stratton's premises, the original one, not the revised one, but the original one, the one that CJ responded to from JP Moreland and him, Stratton, that one is a little bit too, it kind of bends the rules in my mind slightly between, deduction and induction, insofar as the inductive premises right are likely to be true, but then you need evidence to show this. It's not empirical. So that means you need independent and contrastive reasons to show this to be the case. And almost like everything Stratton produces, he fails to produce an independent and contrastive reason, other than the fact that it's either definitional, or that just is what determinism means, or that's just what freedom means, or sourcehood means, or whatever. I'm thinking specifically of his free thinking argument. Like the inductive supports that he gives for the inductive premises just loop back to the premises themselves. There's if you look at his book, his 2020 book, in the deliberation and liberation argument, in one of his it is so obvious that he's just arguing question-beggingly that deliberation entails libertarian freedom. And there's good arguments for the fact that deliberation entails indeterminism, at least. He applied none of them. And the way he defends them just loops back to, oh, well, you don't have alternative possibilities. That's why you can't deliberate. And deliberation requires, alternative possibilities. But then if you're like, okay, why does deliberation require alternative possibilities? Well, because you're not the source. Well, why aren't you the source? Well, because you don't have alternative possibilities. So then why do you need alternative possibilities? Well, because you're not the source. I'm paraphrasing hardcore, but off the top of my head, look at my volume 2. I go through my volume 2 on academia. I go through a whole section on the deliberation argument, and really the whole free thinking argument. Here's the point. The point is, that's my gripe from the original argument, is that I don't think he has independent reasons to show why why certain premises are the case. In particular, the premise that we're looking at is that yes, God does, all Christians hold to false theological beliefs, and that to me is heavily inductive. You can't prove that empirically, and so I don't know why at all we would accept that premise. But from what Josh has said on this article, and overthinking about it, I mean, generally, I think he might be onto something. I think empirically, you're correct. They're correct, I think, contrary to CJ, that the evidence empirically is on the side of this inductive premise. And that, to me, is independent of that original premise, regardless of the induction and deduction debate. It just so happens, though, that he changed the premise. Stratton changed the premise, to not just all Christians, but all people. And I think that is so much worse. And so I'll kind of pivot just slightly here, and but we can go back to the deduction and induction. But suffice to say, I kind of agree with Klein here on the whole deduction and induction piece all the way down. I think that CJ should just drop it and should just be like, okay, it's a little bit pedantic, or even if he wants to hold his ground, say it's not pedantic, just it's a stalemate in my mind. Let's just drop it and go to the heart of the matter instead of these little things. But when they changed the argument, that's a game changer. They changed it from all Christians, which was kind of like, okay, is this inductive? Is this deductive? Where does it fit into the argument? Blah, blah, blah. It could be either. It's probably inductive. There's some good evidence that all Christians hold false theological beliefs. Okay. But then they changed it to premise 2 now. All people, including Christians, hold false theological beliefs. What the junk? So my first response is all people. Okay. Does that include Jesus Christ? Because if it includes Jesus Christ, that premise is absolutely false.
Right.
Because I'm pretty sure Jesus Christ had true theological beliefs, and all true theological beliefs, and no false theological beliefs. And I'm pretty sure he's a person. And I'm pretty sure he's the best Christian that's ever lived and ever will live. So, like, I really don't see how that premise could even hold water if we include the full humanity of Jesus Christ. And I'm sure Dr. Stratton and Klein are going to hold the full humanity of Jesus Christ as evangelical Christians. So either A, go back to the original premise and then we're back at the stalemate, or B, what they could just say is reword the premise and just say all people, including Christians, but not including Christ, hold false theological beliefs. But that kind of seems like special pleading, moving the goalposts, maybe ad hoc. Or they could say all fallen people, including Christians, hold false theological beliefs. Then, okay, we have a good workable premise. We're back to the induction and deduction thing. Is this kind of inductive? How can we weigh it? Is there evidence? And I think there probably is good evidence to suggest, even though I'm skeptical, it's not like it's impossible, like broadly metaphysically impossible, that all fallen people have, true theological beliefs. But I think the evidence is on our side empirically, and on their side to say all fallen people, including Christians, have false theological beliefs. So I'm willing to grant the premise, even if CJ is not.
Yeah, and one thing I will note is because I think we've gotten to a point, both with Stratton's response and with Klein's, that this argument is not, at the very least, not necessary, and potentially even could be wrong. I'm not going to use it in the volume 2, if you'd like to call it that, or 2.0 of this paper. For those who don't know, it's been suggested by some professional philosophers that I should submit this to Faith and Philosophy, and I will be reworking it if I do that because I don't think it's up to snuff there. But so yeah, we're going to get a 2.0 this point, and it won't include that. And it also might end up including a section on, hey, this has now been changed, so let's respond to both of them. But digression aside, it will not be included in that. It's not that I think it's a bad point. I just think it's definitely moved beyond that.
Yeah.
At this point. Now, we're still here, of course, because we're just reading through the article. So let me just go through it briefly. Here's another argument with 2 inductively justified premises. All people who produce or have the capacity to produce male gametes are men. All trans women have or had the capacity to produce male gametes. Therefore, all trans women are men. And this actually is an example of why I think this is not a pedantic point. Because premise 2 is not true, actually. There are definitely individuals who would refer to themselves as trans women who have been born intersex or with some sort of a biological deficiency. So you can see the fact that because something is likely the case, because this is likely true, the overwhelming majority of people are going to be born as functioning biological females or males, right? But there is a slight sliver of people where that's not actually the case. And therefore, you can't make the argument that every single person who's ever been a trans woman is actually going to be a functioning biological male transitioning into a female, because that's not actually always true. There are intersex individuals who identify in whatever way they identify with, who are going to be considered, trans women or trans men and are not functioning biological individuals, whether of the male or female sex. And I think that's the very problem, right? That's the very problem. You're taking something that is likely true, saying, therefore, because this statement is likely true, my conclusion is definitively true. And I think that this example, better than the other one, demonstrates why you can't go there. But I've already given all that. And unless you want to comment further, I don't think that I'll just move on.
No, I know it's way down. I don't know if you wanted to skip through all of this, but he does give a response to me. Like, I think Klein is, I'm going to affirm what Klein says. He says way down at the bottom somewhere. It's not page numbers, so it's kind of hard to tell you. But he does say, and I quote him from this article, it's not simply that all Christians disagree. It's that there are numerous contradictory theological positions held by the majority of Christians, maybe all as far as we know. Determinism, libertarian free will, real presence of the Eucharist, symbolic role versus symbolic role of baptism, list can go on. Because of the law of the excluded middle, we can know empirically, I'm putting the word empirically there, that a Christian that believes all things are determined is either right or wrong. And so the same could be said for every Christian belief. It is either correct or is incorrect. And the scripture indicates that all Christians will need sanctification, like being mature in Christ. Thus, they will not have a perfect set of theological beliefs and behaviors until the final consummation of time. This is why I personally, because the empirical evidence is kind of on their side, I think it's more likely true than not that Christians have at least one false theological belief. Whether you believe in determinism or not. So again, we can keep going back and forth debate it. CJ and I will probably disagree here, but then again, like I said, it doesn't really much matter because they changed the premise anyways, right? To all people, including Christians, and we can just shove Jesus Christ himself, in there. And it says including, by the way, so like it's including, not like we're not saying that Jesus is a Christian himself, although I think he probably is because he's the founder of it. But it's that he does have true theological beliefs. On top of him, all false, including Christians, they want to say have false theological beliefs, which then proves the premise wrong because he is a person, right? And so the including Christians piece on that premise is not inclusive of it's a disjunctive relationship with the all people. It's not included in there. So you can have all people, but we have Christ, including Christians, and it would still disprove the premise. So I think because they changed the premise, it's to a far worse. Almost none of this, in my mind, matters much. I'm not sure what CJ thinks. But all the induction,
I tend to agree.
It to me just doesn't really matter. But CJ can still hold his ground. I'm going to probably affirm with Klein.
Yeah, and the only other thing in this section I would like to mention here. Well, actually, it's not the only thing. There is two other points. I do want to briefly have. This is the second other point I was forgetting here. Is just here. He does talk about Dr. William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument begins with an inductive or at least an empirical generalization. That's definitionally not true. His Kalam cosmological argument starts with anything that begins to exist as a cause. That's just a definitional fact. In beginning to exist, you are caused to exist by something. So I would quibble with that briefly. But this is the meat of the matter, and this actually would be the point where, as Colton has kind of already hinted to, where we wouldn't disagree necessarily, which is the same can be said for Tim's inductively justified premise that all Christians hold false theological beliefs. To deny this premise would be akin to the gender theorist denying premise one of the above argument. Now, again, this was changed. It's not all Christians, it's all people, right? So that's the first problem you have. There are numerous individuals you could mention, and you might be being pedantic in this regard, but where this would not apply. For example, individuals on the other side of eternity. For example, Jesus Christ himself. For example, Adam before the fall. So on and so forth. So there, even if you limit this to all Christians, that even still would include some Christians, right? The other problem here, though, is I think a case could be made that there is there's no reason to accept this argument that all people have false theological beliefs. The Jesus example already kills it. You got to reword, right? Which is perfectly fine. Reword, make a stronger case. I even in the article I create what I call the Bob problem. Bob has false theological beliefs. Determinism is true. Bob therefore is determined to believe his false theological beliefs by God, right? I'm paraphrasing there, but nevertheless, that I feel like that's a much stronger. It's making the point Stratton's trying to make, but just wording it without these potential pitfalls. But even Jesus being beside the point, I think you could make a case that perhaps the apostles and prophets did have perfect theological beliefs. I've heard the objection, well, wouldn't that make them perfect themselves? And the answer to that, of course, is no. If I can have a perfect knowledge of how many buttons are on this remote without having perfect knowledge generally or being an ontologically perfect person myself, right? And in this particular case, I'd have to count them. I'm not going to do that, but nevertheless, you get the idea, right? To have perfect knowledge of a specific thing is not the same thing as being perfect oneself, right?
Yeah, I think to point that out to make it a little bit more vivid, I'm pretty sure demons have a perfect set of theological beliefs. They have a better set of theological beliefs than we do in some sense, right? Because they know
for sure.
And they still deny him. And so they tremble and they believe, right? So I think, to your point, that is true. That just because you have a perfect set of theological beliefs doesn't mean that you're, perfectly sinless.
Exactly, right? Yeah. And I think it could at least be argued that perhaps Paul the Apostle, perhaps Moses, perhaps Isaiah, maybe John the Baptist, maybe did have a perfect set of theological beliefs. I certainly don't see any evidence that Paul had false theological beliefs. I'm not sure how you could trust him to write scripture if he did have false theological beliefs. One might say he doesn't have a complete set of theological beliefs. Maybe he's missing something, right? But he's, at the very least, all knowledge he has access to. I think you could certainly make the case that all the theological dilemmas he has access to, he probably has the right answer, right? He's speaking directly to God, and he's writing scripture by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So the point here is just to say, I don't think that first premise can be granted, that all people necessarily have false theological beliefs, or even all Christians necessarily have false theological beliefs. Scrolling down here, he says, the same deity who determines CJ's false theological beliefs in the first place is the same deity who determines the manner in which CJ experiences sensations of evaluatings. Thus, the experience of truth-finding Cox has is not trustworthy to lead to theological truth, since it is also determined by a deity of deception. I have no reason to accept that sentence. I don't think there is any reason to accept that sentence as true. A deity of deception can determine me to hold false theological beliefs through various means. For example, he can determine me to have false theological beliefs through incomplete access to the data. So maybe at that point, my faculties actually all function properly, and if I had complete access to the data, I would come to the right belief, but I don't actually have full access to the data, and so I don't have a correct theological belief. He could make me emotionally attached to something. My reasoning isn't failing in that particular regard, but I am, for some reason, emotionally attached to A or B doctrine when C doctrine turns out to be the case. He can, of course, make somebody schizophrenic, in which case, you won't trust any of their rational abilities at all, but that doesn't apply to all peoples. Not all peoples have deficient rational beliefs in that, or rational faculties in that regard, right? So I don't know about you, Colton. I see no reason to accept the idea that because a deity of deception has determined, and this is granting that he is a deity of deception, because a deity of deception has determined my truth-finding ability, therefore I have no reason to trust that truth-finding ability.
Yeah, I don't see any reason why. I think their epistemological framework is so strict. It's so strict. It's like mind-boggling to me. And we've had other videos like this, right? Like where we went through even like, for instance, the birthday party. I think what they're trying to get at is, okay, let's just say my wife, deceives me about my birthday party or whatever, a surprise birthday. And, day comes by, oh my goodness, I'm deceived. Blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't say that, right? But like, oh my gosh, I'm surprised, blah, blah, blah. Next year comes around, right? And she's like, oh, I need you to go out to the store and pick this up, blah, blah, blah. I think what they're trying to get at is I have now good reason to suggest I shouldn't actively trust her in the same way as I did, as I usually do in other things. Like in that topic, in that sense, in that way that was deceived for me, I cannot trust her for it. But we've already talked about that in other videos, and I don't think it's ever been brought up, and so I won't really address it here. But I think that's probably what they're getting at, but I could be wrong. But either case, I disagree.
And with that, we'll go ahead and skip ahead a little bit because we've said basically everything that we will say about the deduction-induction problem. Mr. Klein, if you watch this and you feel like there was something not addressed that would have been addressed had I not skipped there, then please do let me know. This is one point I will point out briefly. I say even if it is not false, in other words, even if it is true that all Christians have false theological beliefs, it is unprovable and unfalsifiable, meaning that one cannot substantively demonstrate it to be wrong or right. Again, deduction relies on certainty. Even if you want to cross that last part aside, considering everything that we have said here, I do think it is the case. All Christians have false theological beliefs is not something that you can prove, nor is it something you can falsify. It's a statement that you can say, I either generally think is reliable or generally think is unreliable, but there's no way to demonstrate it to be false, and there's also no way to demonstrate it to be true. If for no other reason, then you would need a perfect set of theological beliefs yourself in order to demonstrate that somebody else had a perfect set of theological beliefs, or that somebody else had an imperfect set of theological beliefs.
And to me, like, if you read like the next paragraph down, he actually mentions Jesus Christ, which I totally forgot. So as far as proof goes, experience in good theology would be able to easily show that all people after the fall possessed at least one false theological belief, except for one person. But then again, if we look at the premise exactly how it's worded, it doesn't say that, no, it doesn't. It says all people. And so again, it might be pedantic to some, but you need to word the premise in a way that's like, it's just not a good premise. I'm sorry, like, reword the premise. Stop just shotgunning arguments every 3 years. Reword the premise and specifically state that's after the fall. So thank you, Mr. Klein, for stating specifically that. Otherwise, Jesus Christ is a counterexample. So I sure hope in recent months now and within a year that the arguments change then, right? We should see the argument change and include this after the fall or fallen people. All fallen people have a false theological belief.
Yeah, and it is interesting too. He notes later on in that this third paragraph, the law of gravity is impossible to actively falsify, but it is not unfalsifiable. I don't 100% know what that means. If I'm being honest with you, it sounds like he's saying A and not A at the same time. But even if I just put that to the side for a moment, in this specific example, if you do not A, have access to a perfect set of theological beliefs, and B, know you have access to a perfect set of theological beliefs, then how do you prove somebody else doesn't have access to a perfect set of theological beliefs? We're going to get to that portion about Christians disagreeing in a moment, which was woefully misunderstood and taken out of context. But given the specific topic we're talking about, how could anyone demonstrate that anyone else had a perfect set of theological beliefs? And if it can't be demonstrated that somebody else has a perfect set or an imperfect set of theological beliefs, then how do you know whether or not this is true or false? You just can't. And again, I think that is a flaw in the argumentation because it renders this almost nothing more than an opinion, or perhaps something that can be inductively justified, if you will. But that's being most charitable, I think. Let's go ahead and scroll down there again. There's not much to say. This is still on the inductive point. So here he says that all Christians disagree does not mean all Christians are wrong, full stop. Even if they are all wrong about something, this argument does not prove it. Now, he says here, it's not simply that all Christians disagree. It is that there are numerous contradictory theological positions held by the majority of Christians, maybe all, as far as we know. Determinism and LFW were real presence in the Eucharist versus symbolic, role of baptism, the list could go on. This entirely misses the point of the comment and takes the comment out of context, right? So Dr. Stratton said, we know all Christians hold false theological beliefs because all Christians disagree on something. To which my response was, the fact that all Christians disagree does not mean all Christians are wrong, which is to say the fact that everybody disagrees does not mean every single person in the group is incorrect, right? By the way, my argument here does not mean every single person in the group is correct, or even that some people in the group are correct. The point is just simply to say, if 3 people disagree and each of them has a different opinion, that fact alone does not demonstrate that all 3 of those individuals are wrong. It could be that one is wrong. It could be that 2 of them have an idea that is actually mutually compatible and that those 2 are right and the other one is wrong, right? It could also be that just one is right and the other 2 are actually mutually exclusive, right? The point is, the argument, yeah, we know everybody has a false theological belief because everybody disagrees. That's a non sequitur. It doesn't matter that everybody disagrees because that doesn't demonstrate that each individual in question is wrong about something. It only demonstrates that some individuals in question must be wrong about something, right? But it doesn't demonstrate, like just as one of the examples he gives, determinism and LFW, assuming all other options have been falsified, one of those 2 options is correct. So the fact that there's a dispute, let's say Colton was a libertarian and I'm not, right? The fact that we argue about it, if all other positions have been falsified, doesn't mean that both of us are wrong. It just means that at most one of us is wrong, right? And in a situation like a determinist versus a libertarian, you could even say it's possible that both are right if you take a compatibilist view of determinism. So I wanted to clarify that here real quick because this was taken woefully out of context. And given the fact that I was responding to Stratton's initial argument, I actually think this sentence holds up, even if premise 1 in their original DOD argument is true.
Yeah, I don't know. I still think I disagree. I still think the evidence on the empirical side is if we keep with the original argument, take the fallen out of it, all Christians have a false theological belief. That paragraph to me is particularly damning. I think there's more evidence, and I think Shine one time compared it to the Kalam, right? And I did say in our last video, personally, I find the Kalam more intuitive, like that first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause. That inductive premise, I find that way more intuitive than that. All Christians have a false theological belief. Granted, even with that said, I still think there's something of an empirical nature that could be said. I do think, and I think you're right. I don't think just because they disagree means all Christians are wrong. I'm not saying that. I think you're right there. And so full stop, that's even if they are wrong about something, this doesn't prove the argument. However, the empirical side is the fact that not just because they disagree, just the intuitive nature that like the vast amount of probability, if we perform like, for instance, Bayes' theorem on this, the conditional probability, I don't think it would pop out in your favor. Personally, we can calculate it if you wanted to, but like I don't think it would pop out in favor. I think it would pop out in favor of, given all the evidence, given all the prior probabilities. I really do think that, yeah, we probably have false theological beliefs.
And with that, we now move on to sections that we may not have as much disagreement on. Although there is some sections we're going to disagree on later. If you're in the audience, just so you know, we've actually pre-discussed some of this, so we know it's going to happen. So, quote from me. There's no redefining of deception in the paper, and Dr. Stratton knows this. What the paper does argue is that Stratton is seemingly implying that this deity of deception is malicious. He even compares it to a Cartesian demon. Note, this is in his original 2022 paper with J.P. Moreland. And declares he cannot be trusted. Now, he will certainly then say that this argument doesn't rely on the deity being malicious. Fine, I don't mind addressing that, and did so in the paper. More on that later. But Stratton is trying to have his cake and eat it too here. Either the deity need not necessarily be evil or sinful for deceiving, in which case Stratton's frequently used rhetoric arguing as much is out of line, and I still have full reason to trust him in his word, knowing he always has my interest at heart and does not lie. More on that later also. Or this being is necessarily wicked for being deceptive, in which case the fact that we know indisputably that God deceives believers for righteous purposes defeats this argument. So he responds, I may be wrong, but I believe Dr. Stratton says this makes God like a Cartesian demon, not that he is one, which, to be fair, I never said that Stratton said he is one. I said he compares him to a Cartesian demon. So I don't know what that sentence is actually meant to communicate, but that's not neither here nor there. In fact, I called to Tim to ask him about this. He said that he's often noted that if a demon actually determines humans to affirm false theological beliefs, it would be warranted to refer to this being as a demon of deception. If a deity determines humans to affirm false theological beliefs, it's just as warranted to refer to this entity as a deity of deception. Saying that the former is justified but not the latter, just because it is a deity, is special pleading. Now, I want to be clear here. This is not the argument, right? The Cartesian demon... first off, the point I'm making about the Cartesian demon is that Stratton uses rhetoric that implies God is blameworthy for being a deity of deception. But when you argue with him about the DOD argument, he will say, no, that need not be part of the argument. Now, I'm perfectly fine if Stratton wants to argue that need not be part of the argument. That's okay. We can put that to the side and address this just simply from an epistemological standpoint. In fact, I'd even prefer that because I think that that's where the meat of this argument is. I'm simply saying that Stratton can't argue as if God being malicious is part of the deity of deception argument and then turn around and say, but actually God being malicious is no part of the deity of deception argument, right? If he's comparable to a Cartesian demon, then that's the way you should argue. And if it need not be the case that he be demonic or malicious or anything of that nature, then you shouldn't argue as if he is like a Cartesian demon. Again, he refers to him as similar to a Cartesian demon in his original paper with J.P. Moreland. So that's the first thing. The second thing here, though, that I would want to point out is that I would not, if a demon was determining people to be deceived rather than doing the deceiving himself, I would actually not agree that demon is a deceiver in the same way I wouldn't agree that the deity is a deceiver. And we're going to get more on that later on because that point is addressed specifically by Klein. But determining somebody to be deceived is not the same as deceiving somebody directly yourself, right? So I think that in this particular example, it's not that we're special pleading, well, because you're saying deity rather than demon, that makes it so he can't be a deity of deception or a demon of deception. That's not the point. The point is, in neither case, if they are simply determining in a primary cause kind of way, a primal cause kind of way, right, then they're actually not doing the deceiving themselves, which is the whole point of primary and secondary causation separation, is that primary causes, while they are the first cause, are not necessarily the direct cause, and in fact are not even usually the direct cause. Whereas secondary causes, while relying upon primary causes for their very being, cannot actually or cannot be separated from direct cause. They're always the direct cause, right? So I think there's a little bit of a confusion there as well in what I'm actually trying to communicate in this piece. If you have anything you'd like to say, go ahead. But if not, I'll just go ahead and keep pressing forward.
No, not in that piece. I'm mainly looking at the next paragraph. That last sentence.
Starting with, yeah?
At least.
At least. Okay, yeah. So we're going far down here. All right. At least I know the Cartesian demon has malicious intent to always deceive, so I can arrive at that claim. I think, therefore I am. But the DOD has righteous intent, which means I can't really know when I am being deceived and when I am not for my own good, which means I cannot trust even my thoughts on the matter.
So, and then if we read the next line, so again, this is trust as in a matter of arriving at a conclusion, not in a character assessment between like Cartesian demon and a DD deception, hence epistemic meltdown. You know, empiricism could be true though, right? So like, for instance, okay, if we're going to really push the analogy further and use I think, therefore I am with like Descartes, he's
Right.
a flaming rationalist. Now, like as one who's privy to rationalism myself, I'm not so like naive to think that there are other views on the table. You can do a classical empiricist view and be perfectly fine. And I think that I just think this whole reply here is kind of, to me, silly. Like, you wouldn't even know if a demon themselves, like, for instance, like the external world, like you could, let's just say God exists, and this is where Descartes' modal ontological argument comes from. He's trying to prove the external world, right? So when he's trying to prove the external world, he proves the inside of his mind using I think, therefore I am. But then he tries to prove the external world by thinking, okay, for now, like, I think God, the person who gave me the thought, I think, therefore I am, and I'm paraphrasing here, I can trust because he's not deceiving me, and it came from a good being. And so if he comes from a good being, that wouldn't be deceived. And so what I'm seeing in front of me right now, like my hands or my computer or whatever, has to also come from a good being. And if it actually is something outside of me, I can trust that it is outside of me. So therefore I can trust that's there. So he's trying to use like an argument for God's existence, plus also at the same time, an argument for the external world, all underneath this idea of rationalistic and a rationalistic enterprise. But I just think that the whole thing, the dialectic here, is super strange. Like, I'm not sure exactly where Klein is going here or why he's bringing up, I think, therefore I am. Like, I think even if you're a Cartesian demon, you could still deceive somebody in thinking that there's an external world, depending on if you can get past the external world. So let's just say you deny Descartes' modal ontological argument. Well, then if you deny his ontological argument, then you can't prove the external world. You have to start somewhere else, right? And then you're stuck still in your brain. Even if you see something like the external world out, you could still be deceived on that. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud. I really don't understand why he brings up this Cartesian demon. I think, therefore I am. It's like super bizarre to me. And I really do think, like he says, I can't even know when I'm being deceived and when I'm not, from my own good reason, or for my own good, which means I cannot trust even my thoughts on the matter. I think that only works, again, in your mind, perhaps, but I see no reason why I can't trust in a God that determines external things, but in my own mind determines my own contents. Like, I'm also thinking, like, back to this idea of, let's just say God deceives me about the external world. At best, I can't trust him about the external world given their argument. But I don't think, because, you know, for instance, he deceives, he determines whatever about the external world, but I feel like I can trust him with my own contents of my own mind. Like, he didn't deceive me for that. I have no reason to think that he's deceiving me for that, unless they want to say that if you can't trust the external world, the one who's created the external world, because he might be deceiving you, therefore you can't trust in your mind. I think that's so bizarre and backwards. I think it should be the other way around. That, like, just because you trust the person who gives you the thoughts in your mind doesn't mean that you can trust the person who has made the external world, which is exactly what Descartes' problem is. He's trying to prove the external world. He's trying to go from one thing to the next, the internal to the external. And this is the whole debate in the classical philosophy between empiricism and rationalism.
Yeah, and one thing I would note on that
stuff out, but I don't know if it made sense. I'm just thinking, like, I don't get it. So,
well, and one thing I would note related to that is, you know, not directly related to I think, therefore I am, but present in Descartes' building off of that foundation, right? You said it yourself, the whole idea of, all right, well, I believe God exists and I believe he's a trustworthy being, so I would not or he's a good being rather, morally good being, so I have no reason to believe he would deceive me about this, that, or the third thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that actually applies against the deity of deception argument in this regard. If we know that God has perfectly righteous intentions for anything he does, then one of the things we know is that God would not, in any instance where he does deceive, would not deceive for arbitrary or unrighteous reasons. Now, why is that relevant here? Well, because it does mean that, because if I can't, like, if I have to sit here and say, well, I can't trust anything and just go into straight up solipsism, well, that seems like something that's very arbitrary, right? It seems like God is now using arbitrary or potentially morally wrong reasons to deceive me and causing me to be uncertain about anything in the material world, right? So if we start with the premise that God is generally trustworthy because God is a perfectly righteous being, then even if we grant that God causes all false theological beliefs, he only causes those false theological beliefs in the event that he has a perfectly righteous reason to do so. And we know that because we've started with the assumption that he's generally trustworthy and perfectly righteous, right? So it seems to me like that would lead you to the opposite conclusion of, actually, I probably have good reason to trust most beliefs that I reason my way to, provided that, of course, my reasoning is sound, rather than this epistemic meltdown idea of, I have no reason to trust any of my beliefs because God might be deceiving me. If I don't have reason to believe God has perfectly righteous reasons for deceiving me in that instance, if it's just arbitrary, like, for example, my belief that this remote is in front of me, do I have reason on determinism to doubt that this remote is right in front of me? No, because that just seems to be such an arbitrary thing. And I've already started with the assumption that God is not arbitrary, right? So I don't know how you feel about that idea, but it does seem to me to be, I understand that the point in that regard is epistemology and not whether or not he has good or righteous reasons. But it seems to me like if he does have good and righteous reasons, that leads to a better position regarding how I view God epistemologically, if that makes sense.
No, I think it's good.
From there, then, we move on to, well, we might just scroll through this whole part. All right. Yeah. Now we get to juicy stuff. It's taken us a long time to get to this, but we're getting to juicy stuff. Quote from me, the Cox collapses into creator-creature distinction comment is, to be frank, shockingly inept. What Stratton is referring to here is the section which demonstrates that the DOD argument fails to properly understand primary and secondary causation. Put simply, if God determines you to be healed by way of a good doctor, does that make God the doctor or even the direct healer? The answer, of course, the question is rhetorical. The answer is no. But let's see what Klein says. This is a good example, actually. Have you ever seen the painting of Jesus holding the surgeon's hand as he operates? Great painting, by the way. While this is not what determinists literally believe, it is important to note that it is not far off. Sure, the doctor's work as determined by God is a secondary cause to the healing, but if that doctor is causally determined to possess this medical knowledge, then whether he is a secondary or primary cause is of no matter. The ultimate cause is God himself. Of course, it does not make God the doctor, but that's not the point. Just as me hiring a hitman does not make me the shooter, but it does make me liable for the shooting when the shot has taken place and morally responsible. Now, this, I think, here, let me finish this paragraph. Likewise, even in secondary causation, God carries with himself ultimate responsibility, not humanity, at least so it would seem. This is why we call God the good physician in this instance. This is also why Christians are right to praise God after successful surgeries performed by the surgeon. 2 points, though.
Yeah, this is the juicy stuff.
Yeah, exactly. This is really what we're trying to get to the whole time, right? So, for me, I think, number one, Klein has actually granted this argument without realizing it. Why do I say that? He says, of course it does not make God the doctor, number one. Meaning he is recognizing there is a difference between the deity who determines the deception and the deceiver, just as there is a difference between the deity who determines the healing and the direct healer himself. So he's granting that distinction exists, right? So he can't then turn around and say God is a deceiver because he determines deception, because he's already granted to me that God being...
Premise 4, by the way. That's the premise 4 of the argument. By definition, that's what they want to say.
Yeah, and thank you for reminding me of that, because that's exactly right. So since you've already granted that, you can't now then turn around and say that's not the case. But then he says that's not the point. The point is, and he gives this analogy. If I hire a hitman, that does not make me the shooter, but it does make me liable when the shot has taken place. First of all, from a legal perspective, that can kind of depend. If we're going to take the example exactly as given, that's correct. But there are certainly instances where a primary cause of a crime is not actually held personally responsible for the crime, and only the secondary cause is held personally responsible for the crime. Putting that aside for a moment, because that might be another pedantic thing. We don't actually charge hitmen and people who hire them the same way. And the reason is because the legal system recognizes there is a clear difference. The hitman is charged with murder. The person who pays the hitman, it'll depend on legal jurisdiction to legal jurisdiction. They might be accessory to murder. They might have us charged specifically for hiring hitmen, so on and so forth. The point is, we actually charge the two crimes differently precisely because we recognize there is a difference between shooting the person yourself and paying the person money to shoot the person. And in fact, the person who pays the money typically gets a lesser charge. Now,
so
go ahead.
No, I'll let you finish.
Okay. One may ask the question, okay, yes, but the person who hired the shooter did get a charge, right? And there, I think as a Calvinist, I would have no issue with saying God is responsible for the deception in some capacity, right? But as Calvinists, we're already affirming that anyway. For example, take the Joseph thing, right? We don't say God is not responsible for Joseph being sold into slavery. We say that God intended it for good, as per Genesis 50 and 20, right? So if somebody wants to say, yeah, but the hitman still has, or the person hiring the hitman still bears some responsibility, granted, but God bears the level of responsibility that takes into account his reasoning for it, takes into account the direction everything's going, and therefore he is actually glorified in these things because his intentions, just like the intention with Joseph, is perfectly good, whereas the intention of the shooter is perfectly wrong. And by the way, if somebody wants to quibble with what I just said, that is the explicit message of Isaiah chapter 10, that Assyria is actually being used by God to judge Israel, but Assyria themselves has wicked intentions in doing so, which is why God can then turn around and hold Assyria morally accountable for what they do to Israel. Even though he's the one, and this is his direct words, whether you're a determinist or not, you have to accept this is true, because this is explicitly what Isaiah says. He says, I use them like an axe. They're the rod of my anger, but he does not mean it, right? So this is the explicit teaching of Isaiah chapter 10. God is responsible for what he means to accomplish, judging Israel, which is a righteous act. Assyria is responsible for what they mean to accomplish, which is killing and pillaging and, graping and so on and so forth, right? And there is a clear biblical distinction made between those two things. And I'll stop there. Go ahead.
I was just going to add on. I think that to Josh's point, there's two things that we can talk about with regards to responsibility: the scope and the degree. I think the scope between the hitman and the person hiring the hitman is different, as CJ already explained. We already see this in the legal system. The person who hired the hitman is not charged for direct murder, whereas the hitman is. And the person who is the doctor versus God, maybe guiding the hand of the doctor, they're going to have a different scope of responsibility here. They're going to be responsible for different things. That's just how we would say it. However, to Josh's point, the degree of responsibility might be the same. And I think that this is really what he's trying to get at, where the degree is equal, whereas the scope is unequal. And I, just like CJ, I would affirm, here's the problem. Ready? Morally responsible in what sense? morally responsible in the free will literature, and really the morally responsible literature, like all of that means is just to be morally responsible is just to say you are an agent that is an apt candidate to be called or be judged praiseworthy or blameworthy for certain reactive attitudes. You're an apt candidate for reactive attitudes. It is not by itself. If I say I'm morally responsible in the literature, in the free will literature, it does not by itself designate a blameworthy ascription or a praiseworthy ascription. It just means you're responsible in the sense that you could be praiseworthy or blameworthy or have certain reactive attitudes given to you. So if I were to even grant, if I were to grant that God is responsible and liable and to the same degree as this other person for all these, determining of, false theological beliefs, it is not to suggest that he's blameworthy, and it's not to suggest that he's praiseworthy at all. It's just to suggest that he's liable. But I'll take one step further, and CJ already beat me to it. I don't see why he would be blameworthy if he had good intentions. And this is the whole point. And so I know the argument specifically says, like their new revised argument, regardless of, intentions. If you go back to their original, 5-step argument, again, I would deny premise 4 because I just don't see how it's by definition, just because he determines to believe, certain people, who determines people to believe falsehoods, that just means he's functioning as a deceiver. I would deny that premise flat. And yes, on top of that, even if I were to grant the premise, he does have good purposes. And so even if he was a deity of deception, what does the argument then give us? Nothing. So
Right.
even if we were to grant premise 4, all right, you got us. Ed is true. Divine determinism is true. I guess God is a deity of deception. What's so bad about that? Seriously, what would be so terrible about it? Especially if we have passages like the passage of Abraham, in, Genesis 15. I think it's 15, I believe. So it's maybe 12. I can't remember, but it's pretty damning to me. Like, even if we were to grant the entire 5 steps, what's the problem? But I don't think we should grant the 5 steps, and I think that what CJ says here, I think we can clearly say, in terms of degree, it's different. Or sorry, in terms of scope, it's different for God and us. But at the same time, if we grant that distinction, as CJ already said, it kind of backfires, right? Because then it goes back against the premise 4. If you grant that distinction already, then why is premise 4, by definition, why is that even a premise to begin with? It doesn't make any sense to me. And so, yeah, I think this is a huge concession. I don't know if Klein understands it. That's a huge concession, but I think it's pretty damning.
And by the by, friends, this is why I say we're going to move on from some of the other points in this. Is I think this and the Abraham point, because Klein and Stratton have interacted, some of the other points I made end up being superfluous. And as Colton has argued, they may even be wrong. At best, they're superfluous, though, at this point, because this point and the point we've yet to get to about Abraham, it's clear that we've actually got something there to push. And so that's why the revised version of this paper is going to be pushing on those things. Just in case anybody was curious about why I'm deciding to go that direction. Now, he quotes me again, obviously not, right? I was answering my own rhetorical question that God is not the direct healer in that instance. Likewise, that God determins a deception does not mean that he himself is actually a deceiver. God's agency just is different, whether Stratton wants to refer to that as magic or not. And for context, Stratton had referred to, when I argued, he was responding to my original paper, and he says, CJ wants to argue that God's agency is just magically different. And I said, God's agency just is different, whether you'd like to argue that that's magic or not. And I thought that was a very bizarre thing for Stratton to say, because you know who believes that God's agency is different? Dr. Tim Stratton and every other Christian on the planet. So that was a weird thing for me. Even Warren McGrew, who's a open theist, would affirm that. I mean, come on, guys. What are we talking about? Anyways, He says, I think it's funny here that CJ claims creator-creature distinction is silly, yet he ends here with a statement stating exactly that. Now, let's go back up real quick. That is not what I said. I said the Cox collapses into creature-creator distinction comment is shockingly inept, right? I'm not saying the distinction itself is silly. I'm not even saying that the idea that I'm making a creature-creator distinction is silly. I'm saying that Stratton's specific comment regarding the matter was shockingly inept, right? And his comment regarding the matter was essentially that Cox is just trying to hide behind a creature-creator distinction in order to get around the fact that God is a deity of deception, which, as Klein demonstrated just now, is not actually the case. It is just true that God is not the doctor. It is just true, therefore, that God is not the deceiver. There is a separation there, whether you'd like to admit it or not, right? That's not to say that a creature-creator distinction doesn't exist, but it is to say that saying you're just hiding behind a creature-creator distinction is an inept comment because it fails to understand why I'm bringing up the primary-secondary causation point in the first place. Which, for the record, is another point. I was actually referring specifically to primary-secondary causation, not creature-creator distinction. There's a big Venn diagram there, I understand, but they're not exactly the same thing. So I want to point that out also. If you'd like to comment, go ahead, and then if not, I'll keep reading.
I'm good.
All right. He says, ironically, the creator-creature distinction here is actually very important, as God is the only one with the power to determine all things, not that he does. Of course, his agency is different, which goes against what Stratton said earlier, but that's neither here nor there. But one must demonstrate how that agency being different means we can trust our faculties of reason and believe if God uses the agency to determine our holding false theological beliefs. That's the relevant point not to be missed. And the demonstration of that, as we've already said, is that you can't make the argument God determines deception, therefore God is deceiving himself, right? And not deceiving himself as in he's self-deceived, but that he is the one doing the deceiving himself. That's what I mean. So we've already actually...
Here, I don't understand, like, why he needs... Why do we need to show that how the agency is being different to show that if God uses that agency? Like, I don't get that sentence. So his agency is different, but one must demonstrate how the agency being different entails that we can trust our faculties. What? No, it doesn't. Like, I don't see why that's necessary. Why do I have to show that his agency is different just so I can trust our cognitive faculties?
Yeah, and
all we have to show is that the agency is different, which he grants, and that should give us full stop pause, like, to just stop the argument. Specifically, premise 4, as it's stated. So it seems to me, here's why I kind of get frustrated with Klein's responses here. He has a revised DOD, yes?
Right.
But the way he's describing that sentence calls me back to a previous version of the DOD. And so, like, why, like, trusting our cognitive faculties, and also, you know, if God determines it's on trust, like, he's not trustworthy, you can't trust the Bible. Like, those are all previous versions of the DOD, right? But
right.
Notice the new like argument has nothing to do with trusting cognitive faculties, which is why I find that whole thing means we can trust our faculties wholly bizarre. Look back at the original, like the actual original argument. It has nothing to do with trust. It just says, if premise 4, which is the premise I would reject, a being who intentionally determines people to believe falsehoods about what ultimate reality is, by definition, functioning as a deceiver, is by definition functioning as a deceiver. That's the entire premise. There's nothing about untrustworthiness. It's nothing about trusting our cognitive faculties. So which one are we using? Are we using an old one, or are we using this one? Because this, like, sentence right here from Josh makes no sense at all if we're using the new one. Like, I have no clue, dude. Like, maybe you can see it, but I don't see the vision, dude, at all.
Yeah. Well, and I'd even say too, and I agree with what you said completely. But I'd even say, too, I think the granting of that distinction is even still a problem for the previous one, right? Because if he says, if we go back to the previous version of it, if God determines, premise 2 was if God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs, then God is deceptive, right? So the granting of the distinction does destroy premise 4 in the new version, but it also is in major conflict with premise 2 of the old version, even. Because it is granted that there is a distinction between primary and secondary causation. Therefore, you can't actually argue God is being deceptive, because God at no point has ever actually deceived, given this syllogism. Now, we're going to argue in the future of this video that God actually has deceived, so this actually fails on an entirely separate front as well. But given the granting of primary and secondary causation, which, by the way, I'd like to point out, my philosophy teacher, because I am currently going to school, for those who don't know, to get a philosophy degree, which will eventually be a PhD, Lord willing. So you can't run for me forever, Stratton. But at any rate, that was actually his, when I had him review this before I published it, he said he thought that the point that took out Stratton's argument entirely, and this man is also a PhD professional philosopher, was the fact that primary and secondary causation, if they are properly understood, especially as Aquinas lays them out, if they are properly understood, then we do have to recognize determining or being the primary cause of deception in no way entails that you are deceptive yourself. And again, I have to keep stressing that point, because now in this, it's a complete defeater in the new version, because it negates the by definition argument whole hog. But even in the original version, you can't say God is being deceptive if you grant that being the primary cause does not equate to being the direct cause. Because in that instance, then God maybe isn't being deceptive. He might be, but he also might not be. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. So it's just, I don't know why. It just bugs me. It's like, just stick to one argument. So,
yeah.
But when I see this trust our faculties of reason, that has nothing to do with the new argument, as far as I know. And if it does, then it's completely not clear. And that's not our fault that it's not clear. It's your fault, because you have the burden. It's your freaking argument. So argue it. Show me the supports. And if you don't have it, well, then why should I believe anything you're saying? I mean, that is the point of an argument. So it just frustrates me, but we can move on.
Well, I agree. I totally agree. We keep reading. Even if Cox kicks the can back to a secondary cause, it is God's intent to cause via those causes, which were also determined via God's decree on Calvinism. That's I'm just noticing this sentence is not, maybe I'm reading it wrong. Let me try this again. Even if Cox kicks the can back to a secondary cause, it is God's intent to cause via those causes, which are also determined via God's decree on Calvinism, people to hold untrue beliefs about himself. Okay, I get what he's saying there, but that sentence could have been worded a little better. He's saying that it is God's intent to cause people to hold untrue beliefs about himself. But I think the addition of the comma and also the parenthetical made that a little difficult for me to understand. Maybe I'm just an idiot, though. That's totally possible. Anyway, he says, why is that? Why is it God's intent to cause people to hold untrue beliefs about himself? This must be explained to hold a justified belief. Molinism can explain this through libertarian freedom and middle knowledge. God actualizes a world in which he knows people will be mistaken on their own, but he does not use primary or secondary causes to necessitate their arriving at false conclusions. But Calvinism has no such mechanism. 2 problems. Number 1, this sentence, this parenthetical about Molinism, that depends on the Molinist you're talking to. I bring this up all the time. But William Lane Craig, in his debate, you can kind of call it, it's really more of a discussion, but they're on the Unbelievable podcast. In his debate with James White, he says, and this is a paraphrase, but it's damn near the quote. God looks at all of the various timelines and chooses the one that he wants that best fulfills his purposes. James then pressed him, okay, But where do those choices come from? Is there like an essence of James White? You guys might remember there was this meme about, it was like a cologne and it was essence of James White that would go around in these theological circles, right? He's like, is there like this essence of James White that makes the decisions existing in the ether somewhere? Where does that essence come from, if so? And Craig's response was, no, that's not the case. It's just that the subjunctive conditionals in each timeline lead you to be the person you are and therefore necessitate the choices you make. I don't know how that's not causal determinism. Because as Craig describes it, each person, first, he agrees that people decide to act based upon their greatest desire. Second, he grants that the greatest desire you have is not a result of your cognitive ability, but is something that happens to you. And third, he grants that the reason you have that desire is because of a massive domino effect from the start of your life. All of these different subjunctive conditionals lead you to the point where you will inevitably make decision A rather than decision B. Now, is every Molinist going to word it that way? Probably not. Probably not. In fact, Stratton would almost certainly not, because I've heard the way Stratton talked about this also with James White, but amongst other people. And he does not seem to communicate it the same way William Lane Craig does. But at least as William Lane Craig laid it out in that Unbelievable podcast, I don't see how that's functionally different from determinism, number one. Number two, I don't see how this gets around the problem now that Klein is setting up for himself, and by extension Stratton, where he says people hold to untrue beliefs. This must be explained to hold to justified belief. Molinism can explain this through libertarian freedom. That doesn't sound to me like Molinism explaining it through libertarian freedom. It sounds to me like Molinism explaining it to me through a domino effect that sounds an awful lot like causal determinism.
Yeah, I think I would take a different route, which is totally fine. I wouldn't want to argue personally that they're virtually one and the same. I've never been a fan to say that, Molinism and divine determinism are, one and the same. So I'm not going to necessarily take that route. But I will take the route of him saying God actualizes a world in which he knows people will be mistaken on their own, but he does not use primary or secondary causation to necessitate arriving at their false conclusions. First, I do think the Calvinists can say God actualizes a world in which he knows people will be mistaken on their own.
Right.
Personally, right, if you're going to take a compatibilist, Calvinistic, deterministic stance, they know. Why does he know? Because he determines them to. Well, do they do it on their own? Yes. So both and, right? That's
right.
The compatibilist stance. So they do it on their own. Similar how Jones in the Frankfurt style example does it on his own. Okay, so he does it for reasons on his own, even though he could not necessarily do otherwise. And I think that a Calvinist could take a deterministic sort of Frankfurt style example and issue it so it mirrors that kind of model. And so I do think this is possible. And then he goes on to saying that Calvinism has no such mechanism, that, they can't use compatibilism for whatever reasons, for the primary of which is that if compatibilism is true, then our reasonings would lead us to only our greatest desire, which is absolutely not true. 50 years behind the debate, my friend. So take your seminary degree and give it back then, if that's what they're teaching you. I swear to you. I'm going to say that right now. If that's what they're teaching you, then that professor is completely outdated and needs to give up his tenure and retire already. Or get back into the literature. I can't think of a single compatibilist philosopher alive today, or honestly, within the last 30, 40 years, that would argue something like that. So where are they getting this information from? Oh, I know. The James Whites and the Sproul's and the Clarks and all of the Roger Olsons, all of those who are professionally trained theologians, but they do not hold their theology up to academic philosophy. No academic philosopher of free will would use that kind of language here to describe compatibilism. They would use reasons responsiveness. That's the primary thing that they would do. So if compatibilism is true, then our reasonings wouldn't just lead us to our only greatest desire. We are reasons responsive to the things that we want that are sufficient at that time. It cuts desires out as a middleman and just goes straight to reasons, which seems to be the logical route, right? And I've written extensively about this in my volume 2 reply to Stratton. He goes on down at the bottom and just says, utilizing compatibilism to explain why we have false theological beliefs may work, but it fails to explain how we differentiate between those false and true beliefs. No, it doesn't. Not at all. In fact, one of my later, I think it's around like the 200-page, 230-page mark, I actually give a reason, right? Reasons why I think we have what we call divergent mechanisms in each individual agent, right? So why do we have one agent who's determined to be this and one agent to be determined to do this when the mechanism seems to be the same, the determinism, but they believe in two different things? And so I give an account in that volume of why compatibilism can affirm using guidance control, Fisher and Revisa's famous guidance control, why we can use guidance control to pinpoint exactly why they have varying individual beliefs. And so I think this is actually quite plausible. So I'll kind of read a little bit about it, if you don't mind, and then this will hopefully kind of seal the deal. Okay, so this is on page 233 and 234. Right, suppose that S1, an agent, non-derivatively believed in some sort of belief P at time 1. Let's suppose that S1's belief in that belief in P issued from a moderate reasoned responsive mechanism that was tracked by the evidence for P that S1 had at T1. Now let's just say at T2, though, S1's belief in that original belief P changed slightly because S1 was presented with a new modified set of reasons issued from her, again, moderate reasoned responsive mechanism from guidance control that is compatible with determinism in light of the new evidence. S1 is regularly receptive yet weakly reactive, all conditions from guidance control to reason for yet weakly reactive to reasons for her new belief, let's say P2. Right? This new belief is derivative of S's previous belief P1 for whatever reason. So belief P2 is similar to P1. It is only modified slightly due to reasons for belief, which is also modified slightly. What's the point? Evidence can change the way you reason. That's the point. And evidence is objective. That's the point. And we all have different kinds of evidence, right? So even if God determined everything, my evidence that's determined in my world, in my circumstances, is vastly different than the evidence from CJ. Why? Because he's determined to grow up in a different environment, a different circumstance, a different lifestyle, a different worldview than I have. We might come to, similar beliefs, but just because the same mechanism, God determining everything, is true for both of us, let's say, doesn't mean that we will automatically come to the exact same true belief, which is originally what Stratton has wanted to say, especially to Bignon way back in the day. And then Josh Klein here is kind of pinpointing that. Why do we have different models? Implying in my mind, if determinism was true, we would all believe the same thing. But that's freaking absurd. Why? Because we all have different dispositional environments. And because of the evidence, my agency, my belief structure might be changed slightly because of that evidence. That is the whole point. And that's completely compatible with determinism. That's completely compatible with compatibilism. And that's completely compatible with this idea that I have a divergent set of beliefs as CJ, even though we were determined by the same God. I think it's even more magical, let's say, if God determined us to have the same beliefs, that would literally entail that no matter what the evidence around me suggests, I would believe the exact same thing. And that doesn't seem rational in my mind, right? So that seems wholly bizarre. So I'll say this one last thing. So determine, let's just say CJ and I, God would determine CJ and I to have convergent beliefs because God cannot determine CJ and I to have convergent beliefs. Right. So in other words, perhaps God cannot determine both CJ and I to believe non-derivatively from the very beginning of a point, not derivative beliefs, but non-derivatively beliefs, the very first belief that I have of a certain given topic at a certain time, because CJ is dispositionally different than me. So in order for God to zap the belief, whatever that belief is, into the cognitive faculties of both of us, it would literally violate at least one or both of our inner dispositional or teleological agential properties that were non-derivatively developed at prior time slices. So I'll give an example. As a teacher, I'm dispositionally different from my students, right? I'm older and wiser, I think, than my students in many approaches, such as finances, education, relationships, theological beliefs, practical living. This is because I have a different divergent dispositional environment than them. And so that shaped my psychology, my approach to education, God, relationships, teaching. Each of these areas of life quite often allow me to change the reasons for why I believe in what I believe, of course, because of new evidence. And same with them. The difference is because my students remain younger than me, they too will have a different divergent dispositional environment. And none of that requires incompatibilism. None of it. So here's the bottom line. Our values will always not be aligned from what we love and what we have different reasons to and our evidence and all that stuff, primarily because we have different dispositional environments, because God has determined us differently in our environments. None of that is incompatible with divine determinism. So contrary to Klein, compatibilism does have reasons and does have an actual model to show why CJ, because of his evidence, might arrive at a false conclusion, whereas I might, because of my evidence, my circumstance, might arrive at a true conclusion. Even if both of us are determined, even if both of us have compatibilist free will.
Yeah, and by the way, on that note, I would like to say, given the Craig example I was talking about earlier, it actually sounds like the case that you would make would be stronger than at least the case Craig would make. Now, again, I'm not going to say every single Molinist is going to make the argument he did, right? But in terms of a mechanism to explain false theological beliefs, right, it sounds to me like the compatibilistic case you're making here is actually stronger, or at least as strong, as the case that the most well-respected Molinist philosopher in the world right now, William Lane Craig, would make regarding why we would have any sorts of beliefs or make any sorts of decisions, at least as it was portrayed on the Unbelievable podcast. Again, I recognize it's possible that he said something differently somewhere else. That's totally possible, right? So, you know, while we don't see this 100% eye to eye, I do think the points can kind of hold hands with each other, so to speak, in so much as that comparing cases here, and we don't have a case that's being made by Klein or Stratton at the ready. So, you know, we're kind of using one as far as Craig here with, you know, in lieu of that. Comparing cases here, I think that your case is significantly stronger than Craig's case regarding why we actually have these false theological beliefs. But that's just my opinion, of course. We then can move on here to the next point. He says, a rational person does not choose to believe based upon his greatest desire. As Stratton has noted, that's the epitome of irrationality. I don't necessarily know that I think that part's true, but we'll set that aside for the moment because it's not even relevant anyway. It's just not, I just don't think it's true, but it's not relevant to the argument. So it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
That God he quotes me again, that God determines us to have one more time. That God determines us to have trustworthy faculties is not begging the question. Stratton is seemingly unaware of what begging the question is. The argument that we can trust certain beliefs because we have functioning mental and physical faculties does not beg the question unless Stratton wants to argue that any argument that suggests we can trust our beliefs is in effect begging the question. So he asked me, given the deity of deception argument, how can you know that your beliefs are sound? And I said, well, because I have properly functioning mental faculties and direct access to the evidence. And he said that that's begging the question. To which I said, if that's begging the question, then any possible answer I could give you is begging the question. So essentially, you're saying answering my question is begging the question, which, by the way, since this is your argument and not mine, is begging the question. So, there's that there. But anyways, let's get to what Klein says here real quick before we give more commentary. He says, I think the point here is that there is no grounds on exhaustive determinism to say one even meaningfully possesses faculties of reason. Trustworthy or not, if they are grounds, they should not be. Trustworthy or not, if they are grounds, they should not be. My faculties of reason seem to work. It's not a very well-worded sentence, I think. Anyway, how do we analyze whether they work or not? What does it mean for a causally determined individual to possess trustworthy faculties? How does a causally determined individual show that their reasoning is trustworthy if it is not really their reasoning, but it is reasoning stemming from a separate primary or secondary cause that antecedent conditions were sufficient to necessitate their faculties in the first place? Again, I want to point out that right there, antecedent conditions were sufficient to necessitate their faculties. That's exactly what Craig was saying on that unbelievable podcast. Subjunctive conditionals lead them to make the decisions they're making, right? So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, I just don't understand how this follows, right? Let's take, for example, let's assume AI could get to the point where it could reason, okay? Let's say I created an AI that could actually reason, and let's say I created an AI that was so good it could reason properly, okay? In that instance, that is hardcore hard determinism, because the AI does not have a free will in that particular instance. Everything that it does is determined by what I programmed, right? Because that's just the way that robots work. But I have determined it to have trustworthy faculties. So when he says, what does it mean for a causally determined individual to possess trustworthy faculties? It simply means that they have trustworthy faculties. There's really no need to explain it further than that. And the robot example, I think, there demonstrates why there's no need to explain it further than that. If I have programmed that robot, and if I'm capable of doing so, of course, because I know somebody might say, well, AI can't do that. Right now, this is a hypothetical. We're talking a science fiction hypothetical here right now, okay? Which Stratton should be relatively okay with, considering how often he uses the Avengers in his analogies. Hypothetically, if I could create an AI that had proper, we'll call it Einsteinian level reasoning abilities, the fact that I programmed it to have that abilities does not mean it does not have those abilities, right? And I think that's where the disconnect for me comes in this particular sentence. I don't even know why we have to, like, what do you mean by, what does it mean for a determined creature to have properly functioning faculties? It simply means that they have properly functioning faculties and they were determined to have them. I don't know why we need to explain it beyond that.
Yeah, I would just posit the whole theory of guidance control here. Guidance control, this is where I particularly get really a huge disdain when I discuss this matter with Stratton and his followers, or whatever the junk, his free thinklings, when they have this idea of shoving, and I use that word I'm using that word, that's the best word I can think of, literally just shoving it in, their incompatibilism in any socket imaginable. It's like they're packing for Christmas, but they just want to fit that one last sweater inside an already full, and they're just trying to shove it in there. Like, no, it's going to fit. That's how I envision it, right? They're shoving their incompatibilism where it doesn't belong. And then they claim, like, and I tell them all the time, you don't have a monopoly on the definitions of words. Right? You don't have the monopoly on what it means to be yours. Why does it have to mean ultimate sourcehood? Because that's really what the issue is, right? The issue is they're claiming an incompatibilist version of sourcehood, an incompatibilist version of reasoning and deliberation, without any thought that, hey, honestly, I think there probably is some people who disagree here. Maybe we should actually think about those, right? I explain all of this in volume 2, why I think the deliberation argument for incompatibilism fails. I think compatibilism can account for deliberation easy. Why I think, for instance, the free thinking argument fails. I think incompatibilism can account for free thinking easily. And a host of others, like the mad scientist thought experiment that Stratton has thankfully kind of given up on lately. I don't think he's ever really brought that back from the dead, like since like 3-4 years ago. So thankfully, he's just exchanged it with another junky argument like the DoD. But overall, yeah, I would just posit guidance control in here. So he says, how does the causally determined individual show that their reasoning is trustworthy? Guidance control. Now, if you mean show in the sense of outside of this reasoning to get to something that's ultimate, then no, we can't, because that's what determinism means, right? But then if you mean that, it is question begging. Why does show have to mean something outside of the thing so that you can be the ultimate source? It's question begging, point blank simple. And if they don't see it, then that's wild. And if they want to say that we're question begging, I have no idea how it's question begging. No clue, like no exact clue. What are we begging the question on? I'm giving an argument. I think determinism is true. Here's a method or model of deliberation and how I can actually ascertain evidence and reason my way to certain beliefs based on guidance control, epistemically, while being determined. Seems like that's a pretty good argument. And then what's their best response? Oh, you can't do that because guidance and control is actually incompatible with determinism. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, again, it almost sounds like
no philosopher of freedom ever says. He actually told me that one time, CJ. Like, guidance control is incompatible with determinism.
Yeah, and it almost sounds like answering the question in and of itself in Stratton's mind is begging the question. And it's like,
if you go back to the original videos between Bignon and Stratton in 2020, Bignon on Eli Ayala's show. Have you seen those videos?
I have not, actually.
Dude, you got to. Those are the best videos ever, right? And Bignon just, of course, schools them, in my opinion. He just completely, he just goes to town because he's brilliant. But he actually says, like, this on air. He's like, this is what makes, because Stratton pulls the same thing. This is what makes Stratton particularly very, what's the word he used? I don't know. Very unpleasant, like an unpleasant interlocutor. Because of this thing right here, begging the question all over the place for no good reason.
One quick second. Hang on.
So I think this whole thing, while CJ is kind of up and about, but I think this whole thing kind of show that I think he's right. I'm not really sure if Stratton actually understands the whole idea of what begging the question is. Like, it's not. I think you can only beg the question if it's your argument. It's not our argument. It's the incompatibilist argument.
I just need to say really quick to Colton's point about Bignon being brilliant. Buy this book. This is like the greatest philosophy book I've ever read in my life. It's so good, dude. For those who can't see, which probably most, Excusing Sinners and Blaming God by Bignon. This is fantastic, guys. I mean, I cannot possibly endorse this enough. Who am I? I don't know. Maybe you shouldn't take philosophy advice from me, but then again, maybe you should. Who knows? Buy this book. It is an awesome, awesome book. And I actually hadn't read this book until this year. I'd only heard Bignon online. And yeah, I was thoroughly, thoroughly impressed. So anyway, you brought up that Bignon's brilliant. I was like, yeah, I gotta endorse this.
It's honestly, his book is the thing that got me interested in the free will philosophy. Mm-hmm. And like, bottom line, like, hands down, it's him and Preciado. I read them the same year, both of their books, in 2020 when the world shut down. I had nothing better to do, right? So just started reading. I read Bignon's. I read Fisher Revisa's Responsibility and Control. And then I read Preciado's book right after. And then Calvinism and the Problem of Evil. And I was hooked. I couldn't let it go. So
now, pressing forward here very briefly, we're basically done with this point, but we want to just note some of the other things he says for fairness. He says, where this gets into begging the question is when one says a thing like, God determines all of my theological beliefs, and also I have some false theological beliefs, but I can trust my faculties of reason about theology because I can use them to reach reasonable conclusions. But how does one know this? One of the points I would make is that co-opting is in the co-opting of LFW language to prove one's deterministic position. What does it say again?
Sorry. I'm irritated, but keep going.
Oh, I feel it though, man. He says, what does it mean to have reason when you say you have reasoning faculties? What does it mean to say you can trust them? Explain that on a deterministic worldview without invoking compatibilism and without using language that appeals to choices. I think one would find it difficult. Two things. Number one, yeah, no,
without invoking compatibilism. Are you what?
Right? Like, why? Why am I held to that standard? Compatibilism is part of almost every classical Calvinistic framework. So why do I have to
explain your free will without invoking your libertarian free will without invoking incompatibilism? Good luck.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. It's completely ridiculous. And for the record, me and Colton have actually already addressed the other point he just made as far as first, we're not co-opting LFW language, right? That's not true. You don't have a monopoly on this. Also, what it means to have reasoning faculties is that you have you have faculties that function properly in regards to reasoning. That's, if we want an explanation further than that, then I guess I could take it to like a philosophical level of what even is reason, or maybe a neurological level of what it means to reason if we want to get into the science of the matter, right? But it's a fairly simple sentence. What does it mean? Go ahead.
It is a simple sentence, and then the next sentence, what does it mean? Yeah, to say that you can trust them. It's because we have evidence. Determined evidence and indeterminate evidence, believe it or not, are the same thing. So,
yeah,
it's still objective, no matter what. Like, honestly, in fact, like, again, even if I was determined, let's say I was determined to believe something atrocious right now, you would call like that. There's an elephant in this room. Right, that you would call me irrational, even underneath deterministic standards. And just because I'm determined to believe in something like there's not an elephant in this room, because I don't think there is based on the evidence, doesn't mean I'm irrational. Doesn't mean I can't trust it. It means I'm following the evidence, dude. That's just basic epistemology 101. Justified true belief, regardless of you hold to externalism or internalism, you're following the evidence. So I'm following the evidence based on the fact that there's no elephant in this room. And heck yeah, maybe I believe that. I'm determined to believe that there's no elephant in this room. Does that make me somehow irrational? Does that mean I can't trust it? No. Why? Because there's evidence, and evidence is objective no matter how you slice it, whether it's indeterministic or deterministic. You don't have a monopoly on what evidence you get to choose. So, even in an indeterministic world, you have no monopoly, you have no control on what kind of evidence is presented to you. Your circumstance, your dispositional environment for the evidence, even given flamingly libertarian freedom, it's still not within your control. And so you still have to make decisions based on, wait for it, the objective evidence. And the same is true for a deterministic worldview. These questions are meaningless to me. Like, honestly, it's baffling that he would even ask them in my mind.
Yeah, and it's funny, he does quote me here where I actually say exactly what I did just say. It goes like this. Stratton puts forward the DOD argument. Stratton then asks, given this argument, how can you trust your beliefs? We then refute the argument and point out that we can trust our beliefs because we have access to evidence, reason, and so forth. Stratton then replies, that's begging the question. How? And that question right there, how? That is the, if you can take nothing else from what me and Colton are saying right now, just take that one word, how. How is this begging the question? Explain it to me like I'm a 4-year-old. Because I don't think you can. And the reason I don't think you can is not because you're not capable. It's because I don't think the explanation exists. Or at least a proper one. Right?
His next response is good stuff. Can we read it? His response. Like, I think Cox answered this question in his response. What does it mean for you to have access to reason and evidence? How does a deterministic system give one access? Access implies some sort of ability to utilize, which I agree, by the way. How do you utilize reason, evidence, and so forth as a determinist? Well, based on a guidance control account. I personally think, although this is other philosophers disagree, like Taylor Sear, I think that dispositional ability is necessary and or at least wholly compatible with a guidance control account. Philosophers like Taylor Sear, I feel like this is getting into the hardcore weeds, so I don't want to bore anybody, all right? But the weak reactivity component and moderate reasons responsiveness, it's really, really, really weak. And so basically it just, in how Fish and Revisa lay it out, is that it only requires one possible world in which the agent accesses that reason to do otherwise. And that is technically all their theory requires. And that is like super weak to me. And so in that sense, it doesn't require a dispositional ability, which, by the way, dispositional ability is compatible with determinism, like Vivellin's like 2013 dispositional ability with the wide and narrow ability. But Taylor Sear, philosophers like that, semi-compatibilists, those who hold guidance control, say that, yeah, because of this, it's not necessary. But I actually align with other philosophers like Alfred Mealy, who says that's far too weak for that weak reactivity component. So you have to beef it up a little bit. But once you beef it up, it includes more possible worlds. And once it includes more possible worlds, what that means is you start having this dispositional ability populating into the guidance control count. So whereas Sear wants to say that the guidance control account, which I'm utilizing, doesn't necessarily entail a dispositional ability, an accessible ability, like what he wants to say here for Klein. I think that we should mend the theory to make it less strict, but once we do, it does pop out of the seams of a guidance control theory. And so all that to say is, I agree with Klein here. Access implies some sort of ability. However, what kind of ability? You can't just come up to it and be like, oh, it has to be a categorical ability, because that's necessarily incompatible with determinism. And that, to me, is begging the question against us. So I think that we can access certain like reasons and have certain capacities and look at our evidence and have this dispositional environment and look at our dispositional environment and make dispositional claims based on that dispositional environment. Why? Because we have a dispositional ability that is compatible with determinism. And I think guidance control is fully compatible with that ability. That is how we can utilize evidence, reasoning, and so forth as a determinist.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to point out here too, in the following quote, quoting Stratton, he says, so the quote is, on determinism, even if one appeals to compatibilism, reasoning happens to you, but you don't do it, right? And I think that this is a weird quote to me, because it seems like any way he could mean this and it be true applies to him also. And any way that he could mean this that does not also apply to him is not true. So as an example, right, if he means something along the lines of, well, all these factors come into play, like the evidence comes into play, your ability to reason comes into play, and these are things that are outside of your control that come into play when you're reasoning. That's true of any position, right? I'm not in control of how intelligent I am. I'm only kind of in control of how learned I am, in the sense that, like, if I was born in 15th century England, I cannot possibly.
It's the same whole idea of epistemic luck. And epistemic luck plagues both deterministic and indeterministic views. The only difference is that a deterministic view would have epistemic luck plus causal luck, right? So luck based on what our causes, what causes us to do stuff. But just because I have causal luck doesn't mean automatically you get out of the frying pan and I'm still in the fryer. That doesn't make sense at all, right? It just means I have another form of luck I have to deal with. But so what? Right? If causal luck is virtually synonymous with constitutive luck, which is what I think it is, and I argue for that in my volume 3, then it quite literally does not matter what kind of luck you have. They're all synonymous. And so, yeah, I think that's to your greater point. Sorry for interrupting you, but
no, you're totally good, right? So yeah, if that's all he means, then we're in the same boat. And if he means that I don't actively partake in my reasoning on a deterministic worldview, that's just false. That's just false, right? Like, it almost would be saying, like, throwing a football is something that happens to you on determinism. It's like, well, no. I mean, on determinism, I actively partake in throwing the football, right? It's not the mere fact that it's determined does not mean that throwing a football is something that happens to me. And reasoning in this regard is kind of the same way, unless he means it in the way, like I was saying earlier, that my faculties are outside of my control. My access to the evidence is outside of my control, at least to some extent. My access to how learned I am is outside of my control, at least to some extent. And if that's all he means, okay, that's just a generalized problem for everybody. That's not a specifically deterministic or indeterministic problem. That's just a problem, right? That we all have to think about. And by the way, that's not a tu quoque fallacy, because it's just to say what we're essentially saying is not, yeah, you too, therefore there's no problem here. It's, look, we're in the same boat as it pertains to this problem. It's something we have to figure out. You can't say this is my problem and throw it at me as if that makes determinism false, because it's actually our problem. And it's a problem for people who want to philosophize about reason generally. So yeah, I took serious issue with that sentiment here. And he does say he's referencing C.S. Lewis. Look, I adore C.S. Lewis. I really do. I have every book that C.S. Lewis ever published, and I'm not even kidding. Easily my favorite author. Also, kind of a terrible philosopher as it pertains to this specific issue. In other issues, he's actually fairly good. C.S. Lewis talking about determinism, much like his own favorite philosopher, G.K. Chesterton, talking about determinism, is woefully inept, even for the time. So, with respect, love C.S. Lewis. I think your average high school philosophy student is probably better at this than C.S. Lewis was, as it pertains to this specific issue. Okay, again, not the other issues. He's a brilliant guy. But anyway, just want to throw that out there real quick. He says down here, libertarian free thinking provided to humans by the God of truth, who desires all people to know the truth, provides a mechanism for trusting faculties, or at least testing them to see if they are trustworthy. And I would just say not any more so than any other view. Libertarianism, in other words, is not unique in that regard. I believe that, and Colton already explained it, I think that compatibilism gives us a mechanism to both test whether or not our views are trustworthy and to search for truth and find it. And I also don't think libertarianism is special in this regard compared to anything else, including even just a hard fatalistic determinism. I don't think that it's, which I'm not a fatalistic determinist, for the record, but I just don't think libertarianism is special in this regard.
Yeah. I mean, the more I think about it, the more I'm reading through it, I think really their issue is not necessarily question begging. What they should actually use is epistemological bootstrapping, in my mind. Like, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it's essentially, it's just this idea of like taking something from its like, it's basically taking a source's reliability and proving it against itself. So it's just like reasoning that verifies some origin source reliability by then fact checking it against the source or origin itself. And that to me is bootstrapping. And that to me does seem like a valid sort of question begging. Maybe that's what they're thinking of all this time. Maybe that's what Strand is thinking of. I still don't think it works, because I think that determinism being true is quite independent of whether or not guidance control is true. So I can still hold to my guidance and control beliefs while at the same time saying that's compatible with determinism. But I don't know. Again, I'm just thinking out loud.
Well, he does actually explain what at least Klein does here, right? He says, if Cox affirms that God determines all things, and that he also affirms some false metaphysical and theological beliefs, then goes on to assert, but one thing I know isn't a false belief is that I have trustworthy and properly functioning faculties aimed at metaphysical and theological truth. How does he know that? After all, if God determines Cox to affirm false metaphysical and theological beliefs, his belief that his theological reasoning faculties are reliable is under suspicion of being false itself. Therefore, it is unjustified, and Cox cannot know his faculties are reliable. In fact, ironically, we all have reason to doubt Cox's metaphysical and theological statements. This is why Cox begs the questions. He continually assumes the very thing that is under scrutiny. So I just take him at his word for it. I think that's the explanation for why he thinks this is begging the question, and I don't think that it works, precisely because of everything we've already been discussing here. The one thing I'll add even at this point, which is not even too important, there's actually two things. Number one, the idea that we have trustworthy faculties is actually not the point under dispute. The point is whether or not you can know things for certain, right? Which those are cousins, but they're not the same idea. More to the point, though, more of an actual strong point here. I actually think this can be refuted by, because he says, how do you know you have properly functioning faculties? I actually think this, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, I think this might be a proper place to reference Descartes with his I think, therefore I am, right? Well, I know I have properly functioning faculties because within my own mind at least, right, there are certain things I can, like the very fact that I am reasoning about whether or not I can reason proves that I can reason. You know what I mean? So I don't know. What do you think about that idea? It's kind of just thought about it, but
I think, I don't know if there's any more to add. I think it's fine. I think I get what he's trying to say. I like for the record, I will say this. I think Klein, even though at the very beginning of the article, he says that he usually doesn't come into these philosophical waters, I think he's explaining far more in detail than Strand ever has.
Right.
Personally, I think he explains it in a more accessible and more straightforward, less rhetorical way than Strand ever has. And to that, I say thank you. I'm learning a little bit more about the intricacies of their position because of the way he's wording it, whereas Strand is just the same thing over and over again, like one hit wonder, That said, I still disagree. I don't see why it would be question begging, only because guidance control itself is completely, I think, let's just say if guidance control entailed determinism, because that's the method I'm using. I think CJ would probably use that method for deciphering differing false beliefs.
Yes.
Or true beliefs. That's the method I'm using. And so if guidance control entailed determinism, then I think that would be a problem. Because then it's all right, now you have the very mechanism itself is necessarily deterministic, and you're trying to use that deterministic mechanism. That is necessarily deterministic to show whether or not you can have true or false beliefs. But I don't think it's the problem, and I could be wrong, but guidance control doesn't entail determinism. So because of that, we can use guidance control as an independent external reason outside of determinism to show that even if we were determined, I can still reason. And that's the whole point, because guidance control is compatible with both indeterminism and determinism. So it doesn't matter if I was determined, I would still be able to reason and follow the evidence and know in that regard, because there's no metaphysical tying to an internalist belief system for epistemology. There's no metaphysical requirements with regards to the epistemology with regards, to whether or not I can know something. So because of that, I don't see why it works, but I do appreciate his exposition, and it helps, and so does yours.
And really quick, I'm going to speed run through a couple of things. If you'd like to stop me at any point, just go right ahead and say, hey, stop.
I do need to leave soon, so we should definitely speed run it.
Yeah. And the reason I want to speed run is for the audience sake, just to let them know, is because there is one last point I want to get to, but there's just a couple brief points to address here, right? So he says, one needs to provide external reason to trust the formation of processes. We already did that. He says, without a clear explanation of how we can differentiate between what is false and what is not, we are left with the same problem we started with. Again, we have, I think, addressed that issue. He quotes me here when I say, when an argument is given, you say, because it allows us to trust our beliefs, it's question begging, which in and of itself is question begging. He brings up the whole addressing is not a refutation argument, which is, nobody's confusing the idea of addressing an argument with refuting it. We're arguing that our address is refuting it, but we'll move on there for a moment. He says, are you in a position to know your faculties fail or not? The answer is yes, we are in a position to know that, as we explained. He says Cox simply has to assume that the theological belief-forming faculties are generally reliable as a determinist. But again, I start, as all Christians do, with the assumption that God is just and seeks and is seeking for us to know things truthfully, right? So that's an assumption he shares. If that's begging the question, that's fine. It's your argument. You share the same assumption. So I guess we just sink in the same boat. I also point out here that faculties being reliable and God determining falsehood are not contradictory beliefs. That is not an A or not A. That actually goes unaddressed. Further still, Stratton says your faculties are 100% reliable to make you believe whatever God wants you to believe. But if God wants you to believe true things, then it stands to reason that your faculties are at least generally reliable to make you believe true things, even if God sometimes causes those faculties to misfire, such that you believe wrong things. He doesn't address that point. He just asks, how do you demonstrate the general reliability? So again, I would say that point has already been addressed. All right, last point we're going to address today. Stratton just fundamentally misses the point regarding Abraham. God does not causally determine Abraham to believe false things, sure, but he does deliberately deceive Abraham, causing him to believe he wants something that he does not actually want. The point of citing Abraham is not to prove that God causally determines false beliefs on Scripture. Rather, the point of citing Abraham is to demonstrate that God in the Bible absolutely and without doubt does deliberately deceive believers from time to time. Response is thus. Here, Cox undermines his own case. It is only a problem that God deceives believers if he has also causally determined them to believe that deception. If it does not follow that it is an issue if God allows human beings to be deceived of their own free will. Otherwise, God's statement of "now I know" is a duplicitous statement. On Molinism, God knew that his test would be necessary for Abraham's continued obedience and the divine redemption story. Middle knowledge makes the best sense of this deception. As an aside, that God knew it would be necessary to provide the ram also speaks to his foreknowledge. I'm going to keep going real quick before we comment there. Determinism makes this entire story seem contrived and superficial. God determined Abraham to be deceived, if we can call a test deception, which you can. There's nothing that the fact that it's a test does not mean it's not a deception, but we'll get there in a minute. Then applauds Abraham for faith God determined him to have. Then God determines a ram so that Abraham can sacrifice the ram God determined he would be sacrificing all along. The story really only works if libertarian free will is true. This passage also seems to undermine compatibilism, as Abraham's greatest desire was clearly to have offspring, so much so that Abraham reasoned with himself with God, that God could raise Isaac from the dead if need be. I would just note this is clearly not true. Abraham's greatest desire is to obey God. And but he trusts that God will bring up the offspring regardless. So, and that's aside from the point that Colton has already made about greatest desire not actually being the battlefield here. Even if greatest desire were the battlefield here, it is quite plain given Scripture that Abraham's greatest desire is to be obedient to God. That's the whole point of the story. That being said, he says that God deceiving is only a problem if God causally determined Abraham to believe that. So apparently, and this is the thing that kind of blew my mind, Klein seems to grant that God deceived, although he does put that parenthetical in, if we can even call it test deception. I would argue the definition of deception is causing somebody to believe something that's not true. God didn't want Isaac sacrificed. Abraham believed that God wanted Isaac sacrificed. God is the one who caused Abraham to believe that. Ergo, God deceived Abraham. It's really quite simple, right? However, it does seem like he's at least willing to concede that Abraham might be deceptive. He just says it's actually less of a problem if God is the secondary cause, i.e. the direct cause, than if God is the primary cause. Now, you can correct me, Colton, if you think I'm wrong here, but that sounds to me like what he's saying when he says, if we can scroll back up real quick, he says, it is only a problem that God deceives believers if he has also causally determined them to believe that deception. So if he deceives them by actually lying to them personally, which I don't think that God lied here in this instance, but if he deceives them personally, that's actually less of a problem in Klein's mind than if he is the primary cause of them being deceived in a first cause, secondary cause framework. And if that's the case, if I'm interpreting that correctly, what are we even talking about? Why is this an issue for anyone?
Yeah, I don't know if that's the most charitable way I'd read that sentence. I think you could probably interpret it that way, but I wouldn't interpret it that way just to be charitable. I think he's just saying, he probably shouldn't use the word only, but I think he's just saying that I think the issue is deception is an issue when causal determinism is involved. It's not an issue when causal determinism is not involved. But I don't see how that speaks at all to the actual story. God, I think, even in an indeterministic framework, clearly deceived Abraham. Are you what? Are you saying that you can't deceive anybody at all? You can't cause false theological beliefs in anybody, even if determinate or indeterminism is true? So he says it does not follow that it is an issue if God allows humans to be deceived. I don't think God allowed Abraham to be deceived at all. I think God told him something, and Abraham took him at face value, even though God told him a false thing, gave him a false desire of what God wanted. And Abraham said, okay, believing in God. That to me is deception. Abraham walked away believing that God really wanted his son to be sacrificed. So much so, Abraham picked everything up, took his son with him, and saying, God will provide a sacrifice. Whether that's something else, maybe believing it would be something else, or him himself. And this whole idea of like believing that, Isaac would actually be resurrected from the dead is irrelevant to whether or not Abraham, in fact, was deceived. So I don't think Klein really gets to the issue here. The fact is, even if indeterminism is true, God didn't allow Abraham to be deceived. He deceived.
Yeah. And if I can add to the resurrection point, the fact that he believes anything about his resurrection actually proves he was deceived, because it proves that he at least thought that he thought it was very possible he was going to run that knife through Isaac.
It's another way. If my wife, again, bringing the birthday party, if my wife deceives me about a surprise birthday, does she allow me to be deceived of my own free will? Clearly not. Like, what? So, no, she deceives me. And let's just grant indeterminism in the entire world here. Am I deceived? I think so. Okay. Same is true for Abraham and Isaac here. That sentence is super bizarre. I can see he's trying to wiggle out of it, but
yeah, and really quickly, I want to, for the audience sake, I want to remind you guys of the premises here, right? Because here in the rephrased DOD, a being who intentionally determines people to believe falsehood about ultimate reality is by definition functioning as a deceiver. Therefore, if exhaustive divine determinism is true, God functions as a deity of deception. So the issue here is that he is a deceiver. That's the issue, according to the way Stratton has laid this out. And in the previous version, if God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs, then God is deceptive, and his word, the Bible, cannot be trusted. The issue here is that God is deceptive, right? So in either communication of the DOD, as Stratton has laid it out, the issue is that God is engaged in deception, okay? Now, we've already demonstrated that this doesn't necessarily follow. But setting that argument aside, we've now demonstrated that God is actually sometimes deceptive, i.e. is sometimes a deceiver directly. And now all of the sudden, Klein says it's not a problem. And I think that's a big issue as it pertains to this dispute. And he does say somewhere here, I skipped over it, I'm not sure where it was, but that the fact that it is our problem doesn't get Cox off the hook. And that's true to an extent, but it does get determinism off the hook, because what it means is this is a Christian problem, not a determinist/indeterminist problem. We all believe the same scriptures, ergo, we all have the same issue that God does unequivocally and without doubt deceive believers on occasion for perfectly righteous purposes. That's just a fact. And if you disagree with that fact, sorry, you disagree with what the Bible says. Not my problem, your problem, right? But again, listen to the wording of those original syllogisms The issue is either A, that God is deceptive. What do you call it when somebody deceives someone, Colton? Is that being deceptive?
No.
So then the second point is that God is a deceiver, right? If somebody deceives someone, are they a deceiver?
Yeah, the whole thing is just like beyond the pale at this point. I think it's just true. I don't know. It's just truly bizarre. I think they missed the Abraham story. I think they missed like the whole new argument itself is like way worse than the original. I actually like the old one back. Like you should bring the old one back. That one actually like gets at least some of the. This one is like worse. It's easier to refute. How is that even possible? You make an argument that's newer, yet it's easier to refute. It's crazy. But
and so with that point, friends, I will say that I hope you guys enjoyed this. I guess you could probably see where I'm going in the future of this paper. I'm going to focus specifically on the primary secondary causation argument and also on the Abraham argument. We will give some lip service to the argument about granting. Are we able to grant whether or not all Christians have false theological beliefs, simply because they grant that Jesus Christ does not, meaning they themselves grant that, in fact, not all humans have false theological beliefs. But the primary focus will be those last 2 points, as I think you guys have seen here today. I have no parting thoughts. Do you have any parting thoughts you would like to give before we head out?
Nope, I'm good. I think we beat it.
All righty. So with that, friends, if you like this video, please consider liking and sharing this video and consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. I have live updates coming in right now, and for some reason, this video had 10 likes, and now all of a sudden it has 3. So YouTube is screwing with my likes right now. I'm not sure why. So please do remember to like and share this video and consider subscribing if you have not done so. Hit the bell to get notified every time we go live. I don't know when exactly we'll be back, but it will be soon, Lord willing. And I don't know exactly what we'll be discussing, but we will certainly be discussing whatever it is. So shalom, guys. God bless you all. And if the Lord wills and tarries, we'll be with you here soon.
I said, won't it be a time?